Beneath Kentucky's rolling hills stretches a network of caves that have claimed entire crews, leaving behind only unanswered questions. Collapsing passages, hidden chambers, and sudden, unexplained shifts in the earth have trapped those who dared to explore too far. Strange echoes, faint markings, and chilling disappearances hint at secrets that no map can fully reveal. This video brings the mysteries of the Kentucky cave system to light, guiding viewers through the eerie corridors and recounting the stories of lives lost underground. Step carefully as the footage uncovers the danger, wonder, and dark history lurking beneath the surface, where every turn could hold the key to understanding, or the shadow of the next tragedy. The trapped miners of Mammoth Cave. The Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky stretches endlessly beneath the rolling hills, a network of dark arteries carved through limestone over millions of years. Its known passages run for hundreds of miles, and yet so much of it remains a shadowy mystery, an unseen world where silence hangs heavy and the unknown waits in every corner. For centuries it has lured explorers, scientists, and fortune seekers underground, but not all who descended into its depths found their way back. Among the most chilling stories is that of the miners who were trapped beneath its stone heart, swallowed by shifting rock and left behind in a darkness that has no end. The lure of Mammoth Cave has always been tied to what lies beneath its walls. In the early years of American expansion, settlers discovered saltpeter deposits, a mineral essential for making gunpowder. During times of conflict, particularly in the War of 1812, the cave became a valuable resource. Men entered the caverns not to marvel at their grandeur, but to scrape the walls and floors for the substance that promised profit and power. The work was grueling, the environment harsh, and yet the demand for saltpeter meant the miners pressed on, deep into passages that no one had mapped with care. The miners who descended into Mammoth Cave laboured in silence, except for the scrape of tools and the muffled echo of footsteps in damp corridors. They carried simple lanterns whose weak flames flickered against walls that stretched into shadows. Few of them could have truly understood the risks of working in such a vast and unpredictable place. Loose rock, sudden drops, and hidden chambers could turn a day's work into a descent into peril. The men knew caves could betray them, but they also knew that their livelihood depended on venturing into the darkness regardless of what it might hold. Historical records of mining in Mammoth Cave are fragmented, but stories passed down speak of crews who never returned from their shifts. Oral accounts describe collapses that swallowed entire teams, their cries echoing once before being cut short. With the cave still largely unmapped at the time, rescue attempts were desperate and often futile. There were no advanced tools, no reinforced tunnels, and no accurate charts to guide rescuers. When the rock gave way, it was not just stone that fell, but the end of entire crews buried so deep that recovery was impossible. One of the most unsettling aspects of these stories is how easily the earth seemed to erase the evidence. A crew would walk into the cave at dawn, lanterns in hand and tools slung over their shoulders, and then vanish into passages where time moved differently. By evening, when they failed to return, families and fellow workers would gather at the entrance, calling into the void. Sometimes muffled shouts were heard from within, fading with each hour. Other times, there was only silence, as if the miners had been swallowed in a single instant, the cave sealing behind them with a finality that defied explanation. Those who dared to search often paid with their own lives. Accounts tell of rescuers entering in small groups, pushing into unstable sections where dust still hung in the air from falling stone. They would find tools dropped in panic, lanterns shattered against the walls, and footprints leading into blocked passages that ended in sheer walls of collapse. The cave offered no mercy, and each effort to dig through stone was met with further crumbling, as if the mountain itself resisted giving up the bodies it had claimed. Mammoth Cave's scale added another layer of terror. Unlike smaller cave systems where collapses might be more predictable, the sprawling corridors and towering chambers here created endless hazards. Rockfalls could thunder from above without warning, sealing entire sections in a single crash. Passages that once felt stable could shift overnight, with limestone slabs tilting and grinding together under unseen pressures. The men who worked inside knew that each creak of stone might be the prelude to disaster. The stories of the trapped miners became whispered warnings for newcomers, cautionary tales about the cave's hunger for human lives. As saltpeter mining slowed and tourism rose in the 19th century, guides began telling visitors about the tragedies of the past. Some pointed to blocked tunnels and whispered that behind those walls lay men who had never been brought out. Tourists lit candles and peered into cracks where the air grew still and heavy, imagining miners crouched in eternal darkness beyond. These stories gave the cave an aura of dread that went beyond natural wonder, turning it into a place where beauty and death seemed forever intertwined. The miner's fate has never been fully documented, which only deepens the mystery. Official records mention accidents, collapses, and the dangers of working underground, but the specifics of how many men were lost and where their remains might rest are left to speculation. What remains is a patchwork of fragments, mentions in journals, lines in local histories, and stories handed down through families whose ancestors worked the cave. This uncertainty leaves space for imagination, and the shadows of Mammoth Cave hold enough weight to make even the smallest rumour feel possible. For those who lived near the cave, the stories carried a lingering fear. Families spoke of hearing cries at night near the cave's entrance, echoes rising from depths too far for any living voice to travel. Others claimed to see faint lights in passages that had long been sealed, as if the miners still carried their lanterns in endless search for a way out. These tales blurred the line between folklore and memory, ensuring that the trapped miners were never forgotten, even as their names faded from history. Standing inside Mammoth Cave today, it is easy to understand why these stories endure. The darkness is absolute, swallowing sound and sense until one feels suspended in a world outside of time. The walls close in, yet the corridors stretch endlessly ahead, twisting into blackness. It is a place where losing one's way requires only a single misstep, and where the weight of millions of years of rock seems always ready to shift. The miners entered willingly, driven by need, but the cave gave them no second chance. The trapped miners of Mammoth Cave remain a mystery because the cave itself refuses to reveal what happened. Without bodies, without precise records, the story exists in fragments that refuse to form a whole picture. Perhaps this is why the legend grips so tightly. It is not only about men lost in stone, but about the silence that followed, a silence so complete that it feels alive. Every collapse, every vanished crew, every whispered echo reminds us that beneath Kentucky lies a world that answers only to itself. And so the story of the miners lives on, not as a closed chapter but as an open wound in the history of Mammoth Cave, where entire crews were taken by the shifting rock and left behind in a darkness that no light has ever reached. The strange echoes of Salt's Cave. Legends surrounding Kentucky's cave systems often blur the line between natural wonder and the unexplainable. Among them, Salt's Cave holds a reputation for eerie sounds that seem to come from nowhere. Travellers and explorers who have ventured into its depths often describe strange echoes that refuse to behave like ordinary reflections of sound, giving rise to whispers of something far less natural. Within the cave's long passages, sound travels in unexpected ways. A single word spoken in one chamber can twist, bend, and return in a distorted form, as if the cave itself were altering the message. Some visitors recall cries bouncing back to them that carried tones they never made, as though a hidden presence added its own voice to the cavern's reply. This uncanny distortion led early wanderers to believe the cave was not empty but listening. Stories from the early 19th century already mention the unsettling acoustics. Hunters who sought shelter during storms reported that their shouts multiplied into several voices, none of which matched their own. One man, unnerved by the repeated sound of what he swore was laughter, abandoned his supplies and fled, convinced that the cave mocked him. Such tales spread quickly across local settlements, giving Salt's Cave a reputation for being alive with sound. Explorers who entered the cave in later years noticed something even more peculiar. Certain passages carried echoes that returned only after long delays. A voice shouted into the darkness might not answer for several seconds, making it feel as if a reply came from something deep inside, rather than from the walls nearby. These extended silences before the echo created an uneasy sense that something waited in the shadows before sending the sound back. Accounts grew more troubling when groups ventured together. Hikers often called out to test the echo, only to hear replies that did not match the number of voices present. A group of 3 once heard 5 distinct responses. The additional tones, described as faint and weary, lingered in their minds long after they left. None of them could agree on what the phantom voices said, but each insisted the words did not belong to them. Researchers attempted to explain the phenomenon. They noted that the irregular shape of the cave, with its twisting passages and dome-like chambers, could easily disrupt normal sound patterns. However, even scientific explanations could not erase the chilling effect of the echoes. Visitors who entered with skepticism often left shaken, claiming that natural explanations did not capture the uncanny feeling of being answered by something unseen. Even guides familiar with the cave could not ignore its unusual character. Some refused to demonstrate the echoing spots for fear of unsettling tourists. Others embraced the mystery, allowing their guests to experience the strange acoustics firsthand. Reports described tourists gasping when echoes arrived far later than expected, or when voices came back in distorted tones that made them sound older, deeper, or layered with additional inflections. The folklore surrounding Salt's Cave continued to grow as these stories spread. Locals began to suggest that the voices were remnants of the cave's earliest inhabitants. The region had been home to Native Americans who mined minerals from the cave centuries before settlers arrived. Whispered tales claimed that the echoes carried fragments of their voices, preserved within the rock like invisible records replaying for those who dared to speak. Superstitions attached themselves quickly to this idea. Some residents believed that disrespecting the cave by shouting too loudly or mocking the echoes would invite misfortune. Farmers near the cave entrance told stories of those who taunted the sounds only to find themselves struck with illness or plagued by accidents. Though these tales lack proof, they added an aura of fear to an already mysterious place. As the 20th century arrived, scientific exploration of Kentucky's cave systems increased, and Salt's Cave was studied more thoroughly. Reports acknowledged the unusual acoustics, but avoided drawing firm conclusions about the supernatural. Still, journals from the time contain entries from explorers who confessed to being unnerved despite their rational outlook. One such entry described the overwhelming sensation that a voice repeated his words with intent, rather than by accident of sound. More recent visitors have echoed similar experiences. Some hikers describe whisper-like sounds that follow them as they walk, seeming to keep pace just out of sight. Others claim that words spoken softly near the entrance can sometimes be heard deep within the cave, repeated faintly as if carried by something unseen through the labyrinth of stone. The consistency of such accounts, spread across decades, makes it difficult to dismiss them as mere imagination. What sets Salt's Cave apart from other echo chambers is not only the sound itself, but the emotional weight it carries. Many describe the responses as mournful or heavy, as though the echoes were not playful but sorrowful. A simple shout often returns in a drawn-out, warped form that listeners describe as filled with grief. This haunting quality transforms a natural curiosity into something that feels closer to a haunting. The mystery deepens when silence is considered. At times, explorers report that the cave swallows sound altogether. Cries for an echo sometimes vanish without reply, leaving only emptiness in their wake. In those moments, the absence of sound feels as chilling as the unnatural echoes themselves. Silence in Salt's Cave is never neutral. It feels heavy, as if something deliberately withholds the response. Over time, storytellers have tied these silences and strange voices together, suggesting that the cave chooses when and how to answer. Though unverifiable, this belief continues to influence how people approach the cave. Many who enter speak cautiously, aware that their words may not return as expected. The uncertainty of the cave's reply lingers as a constant reminder of its unpredictable nature. Even those who dismiss the tales admit that Salt's Cave creates an atmosphere unlike any other. Its twisting passages, damp air, and strange acoustics combine to generate an experience both beautiful and unsettling. Visitors leave with the stories that sound alike in pattern but differ in detail, each convinced that the cave gave them a reply tailored only to them. Though explanations rooted in science can account for much of the phenomenon, they rarely address why the echoes feel so personal. The sense that one's own words are returned altered, weighted with new meaning, creates an impression far stronger than any simple reflection of sound. Whether by chance of geology or by something else, Salt's Cave shapes voices into messages that do not belong to those who spoke them. To this day, the cave continues to draw those who are curious enough to test its acoustics for themselves. Some leave amused, others unsettled, but nearly all admit to experiencing something they cannot fully explain. The voices of Salt's Cave remain as elusive as the shadows that flicker across its walls, leaving behind questions that no clear answer has ever silenced. In its quiet darkness, Salt's Cave waits, prepared to reshape the next voice daring enough to disturb its silence. The Crystal Cave Tragedy. History records Crystal Cave as a place of natural beauty, a cavern lined with gleaming formations that seem to capture light even in the deepest dark. Visitors were drawn to its passages for their shimmering walls, the way crystals appeared to grow out of the stone, and the echoing silence that filled its hidden chambers. Yet behind its enchanting appearance, the cave would become known for a series of events that ended in loss and mourning. Newspaper reporters at the time were quick to sensationalize its glittering chambers, describing Crystal Cave as a place where beauty and danger lived side by side. Articles painted pictures of jewel-like walls that drew in tourists from distant towns, but the same reports often hinted at shadows lurking just beyond the lantern light. These stories helped spread the cave's fame, yet they also planted the seeds of unease, leaving readers to wonder how something so breathtaking could so often be linked with misfortune. Beneath the surface of Kentucky's rolling land, Crystal Cave had been discovered in the early 19th century, not far from the entrance of the vast Mammoth cave system. The attraction of its glistening walls was strong enough that tours were soon offered, leading people into passages that promised wonder but also demanded caution. For many, stepping inside felt like walking into a place that blurred the line between a natural cathedral and an unseen grave. The events unfolded slowly, almost as if the cave itself had chosen its moments with deliberate patience. Tragedy did not arrive in a single instant, but through accidents spread across the years, each one adding another layer to the reputation of the cave. The patterns of misfortune gave it an aura of inevitability, a place where beauty concealed hidden peril. Reports from the time described the earliest accident as a tour gone wrong when a visitor slipped on a damp rock and fell into a crevice that guides struggled to reach. Though the body was eventually recovered, the effort left many shaken, and whispers spread that the cave had a hunger beneath its crystal sheen. This was not an isolated occurrence, but the beginning of a chain that linked the cave's beauty with sorrow. Local guides warned that the cave's winding routes could confuse even experienced explorers, yet warnings often went unheard in the excitement of discovery. Maps were unreliable, and the cave's passages twisted into tight spaces where the air grew thin and the stone pressed close. For those unprepared, it became all too easy to wander deeper than intended, unaware of how quickly the familiar could give way to darkness. The thrill of exploring the unknown often blinded visitors to the very real danger that lay ahead. What began as exploration often ended in disorientation. Accounts tell of visitors lured by the glimmer of formations, only to find themselves lost in winding corridors that resembled one another, so closely it was nearly impossible to find the way back. In more than one case, the simple attraction of venturing a few steps further became a fatal decision, the promise of light replaced by silence and cold stone. At the heart of the disaster that gave Crystal Cave its darkest reputation was the story of men who entered as workers and never returned. Guides reported that in one incident, a group attempting to widen a path triggered a collapse that sealed part of the chamber. Shouts were heard but grew faint as rescuers fought to clear debris, and soon only the sound of falling rock answered back. Their names faded with time, but their absence left a mark on the cave's history. Accounts from surviving witnesses mention the chilling silence that followed each accident, a quiet so complete it magnified every drop of water falling from the stone. In those moments, lantern flames trembled and voices hushed, as if the cave itself demanded stillness after claiming another victim. The survivors described a heavy pressure in the air, a feeling that seemed less natural and more like a warning that the cave was not meant to be disturbed. Such descriptions lingered long after the events, adding to the aura of dread that surrounded Crystal Cave. Stark reports in the press turned the cave into a place of foreboding rather than wonder. Headlines spoke of lives claimed underground and of searches that stretched on without success. The stories of accidents echoed in print spread far beyond Kentucky, turning the cave into a subject of fascination and dread. People came not only to see the formations, but to stand in a place where sorrow seemed etched into the stone. In the aftermath of each disaster, Grieving families and shaken guides spoke of the cave as something more than stone. Some claimed its glittering walls were deceptive, offering beauty to draw people further inside before closing around them with deadly intent. Others saw it as cursed ground, a place that demanded respect in ways visitors failed to understand. Decades later, Crystal Cave remained a site marked by unease. While tourism continued, the stories of past deaths lingered in every chamber, told in whispers during tours and passed along as warnings to newcomers. Even as guides held lanterns high to reveal the sparkle of mineral growth, shadows of memory stretched long across the walls. The cave's reputation as a wonder was forever intertwined with the memory of the lives it had taken. On certain nights, faint echoes like distant cries are said to drift from the cave's mouth, their cause never proven. Locals who live nearby say the sound is unlike any natural cave echo, carrying a sorrowful tone that seems almost human. Whether it is the wind moving through unseen cracks or something less easily explained, those who hear it rarely forget the experience. For them, the tragedy of Crystal Cave has never fully ended, and the echoes serve as a reminder that the past still lingers in the present. Even now, the cavern holds its silence in a way that feels watchful. The gleam of its crystals catches the eye and invites admiration, but for those who know its history, the beauty is tempered by the knowledge of sorrow that seeped into its stone. Visitors still speak of a chill that settles deeper than the temperature, as if the memory of the past waits quietly in the stillness of the air. Some say the crystals still hold the faint glimmer of the lanterns that were lost there, waiting for another shadow to join them in the dark. The Great Onyx Flood. Long before the flood, Great Onyx Cave was admired as one of Kentucky's most striking underground attractions. Its passages, glittering with gypsum crystals and shaped by ancient waters, drew visitors eager to see formations unlike any found above ground. The cave was celebrated not only for its beauty but also for the sense of wonder that accompanied every step deeper into its chambers. Few could imagine that the same water that carved its walls over countless ages would one day return with a vengeance. Visitors once described the cave as a kingdom of stone frozen in mid-creation, where rippled walls resembled waves turned solid and glimmering growth sparkled under lamplight. Families on tours marvelled at the sight. Children ran their hands along cool surfaces, and guides spoke with pride of the cave's grandeur. Yet in their awe, few paused to consider how fragile the balance truly was between the safety of the paths they walked and the unseen forces pressing silently beyond the rock. The first signs of what would come were subtle, almost easy to dismiss. Guides noticed moisture where none had been before, a dampness on the stone that shimmered faintly in lamplight. Pools gathered in low chambers, and drips fell with a steady rhythm from the ceiling. Some dismissed these changes as natural shifts in the cave's atmosphere, but a few began to voice unease, warning that water had found new ways into the passageways. When the rain began, it seemed ordinary at first, another storm sweeping across Kentucky's fields and hills. But as hours passed, the skies opened wider, unleashing torrents that rushed into every hollow and fissure. The ground above could no longer hold back the deluge, and hidden channels carried it downward toward the chambers of Great Onyx Cave. On the surface, few realized what was unfolding below their feet, but within the cavern the storm had already arrived. Water pressed into the cave with relentless force, finding cracks and rushing through them with the urgency of a river breaking its banks. Streams formed in once dry corridors, and trickles turned to rivulets that began to rise along the walls. The guides who ventured inside during the storm described a growing roar, as if the cave itself had awakened with a terrible voice. The familiar paths were no longer secure ground, but treacherous floors slick with running water. Guides recalled that night as a scene of growing panic, for not everyone inside the cave realized the danger until it was too late. Lanterns flickered against the rising spray, and visitors pressed closer together, uncertain of which way to move. Passages that once led to safety were filling, and the sound of rushing water masked the shouts of those trying to direct the way. In the confusion, groups were separated, and some were last seen turning into corridors that quickly became impassable. Panic rose as the flood spread through the lower chambers, cutting off escape routes one by one. Families clutched one another. Guides shouted instructions that could not be heard over the din, and the water swallowed the echoes before they could reach the surface. Every splash and cry blended into a deafening chaos that seemed to stretch beyond the chamber walls, as though the cave itself was amplifying the disaster. For some, there was no path forward, only walls of dark water closing in. Stones trembled under the weight of the rushing current, loosening fragments that fell into the flood with sharp cracks. The once still cave shook with the violence of shifting rock, and each collapse threatened to seal another section. Those who survived later spoke of the overwhelming sound, a thunder from every direction, as though the cave were tearing itself apart while the flood consumed its depths. In that moment, it seemed as if centuries of calm had ended in a single night of ruin. Rescuers entered the following day, moving cautiously into the drenched passages once the storm above had passed. What they found was a place transformed beyond recognition. Pools stretched across wide chambers, blocking paths, and debris from shattered rock lay strewn across the floor. Mud coated the walls where water had surged past, and lantern light revealed items left behind. Torn scraps of clothing, dropped tools, and footprints that ended at the edge of deep water. Local papers printed stark reports of the tragedy, detailing names of the missing and describing the harrowing conditions underground. Headlines spoke of drownings and vanished explorers, painting a grim picture that spread far beyond Kentucky. Accounts of the disaster brought crowds of curious onlookers to the cave's entrance, yet what lay within was no longer the marvel they had come to see. The flood had transformed Great Onyx Cave from a wonder into a tomb. Families waited outside as days of searching stretched on, clinging to hope that survivors might emerge. Some prayed aloud, others sat in silence, staring at the dark opening where loved ones had disappeared. The community gathered with them, offering lanterns and food to the weary rescuers, but with each passing day, hope dimmed. The sound of dripping water echoed from the entrance like a cruel reminder of what had claimed those trapped below. Rumours spread quickly in the aftermath, for not all bodies were recovered and unanswered questions lingered. Some whispered that the cave still held those who had entered, their remains sealed in chambers that rescuers could not reach. Others told of hearing faint cries or the splash of unseen footsteps when they dared to approach the cave after dark. The uncertainty gave rise to stories that blurred the line between memory and haunting, deepening the cave's reputation for mystery. Still today, the memory of the flood shapes the way visitors view Great Onyx Cave. Tours speak of the tragedy with hushed tones, pointing to passages where water once rose and where lives were believed to have been lost. The formations glimmer under artificial lights once again, but for those who know the story, every sparkle carries a shadow. The flood is not seen, but its presence is felt in the silence that lingers just beneath the sound of dripping water. What cannot be forgotten is the way the cave revealed its power, turning beauty into devastation in a single storm and leaving behind whispers that the waters may yet rise again. The Vanished Surveyors of Colossal Cavern. Whispers of Colossal Cavern often begin with its sheer scale, for the cave stretches in a labyrinth of corridors, domes, and shadowy chambers that few explorers ever claim to fully understand. Beneath the Kentucky hills, its passages curve and split like a puzzle that seems to change with each telling. It was here, in a landscape already daunting to the human eye, that a small group of surveyors entered with notebooks, lanterns, and measuring ropes, only to never return. Stories about their disappearance spread quickly, carried by miners, guides, and locals who had long respected the cave's unpredictable terrain. These surveyors were not reckless wanderers but professionals sent to chart the underground expanse, believing their expertise would keep them safe. Yet their confidence only deepens the mystery. If seasoned explorers vanished without a trace, what hope did ordinary travellers have? Beneath the glow of their lanterns, the surveyors would have faced chambers both breathtaking and treacherous. Some corridors narrowed so tightly a grown man could barely squeeze through, while others opened into silent vaults where sound seemed swallowed whole. Each turn posed a decision, and each decision carried weight, for one wrong choice could spiral into disaster. The very layout of Colossal Cavern seemed designed to conceal rather than reveal. Curiosity about their last known route has never been fully satisfied. Accounts place them near a series of forked tunnels, where limestone walls bore strange markings left by earlier visitors. Whether they followed those markings deeper or turned aside toward uncharted ground remains an open question. What is certain is that their tracks stopped abruptly, as if the earth itself had erased their passage. Authorities from nearby towns briefly weighed the possibility of mounting a larger search, but the idea soon unravelled under the weight of risk and uncertainty. The maps of Colossal Cavern were incomplete, and those who knew its layout admitted that new passages seemed to appear as often as old ones collapsed. Local lawmen and miners were consulted, yet even they hesitated, for the cavern's scale was far greater than most dared to explore. Without reliable routes, any rescue would have been little more than sending more men into the dark with no promise of return. Echoes of search parties soon filled the darkness, their torches cutting through chambers as men called out the names of the missing. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the silence became. No discarded equipment, no scraps of clothing, no footprints pressed in mud, only the endless hush of the cavern, broken by the occasional drip of water. It was as though the surveyors had stepped into a corner of the cave that refused to give them back. Memories of those frantic searches lingered among local families for decades. Some recalled the way lantern flames sputtered in unseen drafts, as if the cavern itself exhaled. Others spoke of sudden drops where a misstep could send a man plummeting into blackness. These recollections offered no firm answers, yet they painted a picture of an environment that tested courage as much as skill. Legend grew in the absence of facts. Some believed the surveyors stumbled upon a hidden chamber sealed off by a collapse, entombing them beyond reach. Others whispered about underground rivers, swift enough to sweep bodies into channels no one had ever mapped. Each theory carried its own grim weight, yet none could be proven. Reports from rival guides hinted at disputes between mapping teams, suggesting that secrecy and competition clouded the truth. Colossal Cavern was valuable not only for its size but for the tourism it promised, and those who sought to chart it often guarded their findings. If the missing surveyors discovered something remarkable, perhaps it was knowledge that disappeared with them. Rumours outside Kentucky added fuel to the mystery, as newspapers in neighbouring states began to carry the story with their own embellishments. Some described Colossal Cavern as a subterranean labyrinth designed to swallow men whole, while others hinted at curses said to linger beneath the hills. Headlines suggested both awe and dread, inviting readers to marvel at the grandeur of the cave even as they whispered about its dangers. A few voices argued that the site should be closed altogether, though the prospect of profit from tourism ensured that the cavern's gates remained open. Murmurs also arose of faint lantern lights spotted deep within the cavern weeks after the disappearance. Searchers claimed they glimpsed movement in distant corridors, only for the glow to vanish when pursued. Whether these were tricks of the eye or lingering hopes of rescue, they added to the eerie uncertainty. The cave became not just a place of stone and shadow, but of unresolved questions. Patterns of disappearance are not common in Kentucky's caves, yet the loss of trained surveyors set this case apart. Unlike casual visitors who might underestimate the dangers, these men were equipped, prepared, and experienced. Their vanishing left behind not just sorrow but unease, as if Colossal Cavern itself demanded to be respected in ways no chart could capture. In the aftermath, explorers approached the cave with caution bordering on dread. Some refused to enter the sections last associated with the missing team, claiming the atmosphere felt heavier there, as though silence itself pressed down. Even those who dismissed superstition acknowledged the danger, for every corner of Colossal Cavern seemed to hold its own secret. Decades afterward, expeditions with better tools and brighter lights attempted to push deeper into the cavern, but they too encountered barriers that forced them back. Some sections were choked with fallen stone, while others narrowed so sharply that crawling became impossible. A handful of explorers admitted quietly that certain corridors felt unwelcoming, as if the air itself carried the memory of what had transpired there. Whether through superstition or instinct, many avoided those stretches entirely, leaving vast regions of Colossal Cavern untouched and the fate of the vanished surveyors unresolved. What remains today are fragmented records, notes in half-finished ledgers, fragments of maps without endings, and scattered reports of the last expedition. None tells the full story, but together they suggest a team cut off from daylight in ways impossible to retrace. The trail begins clearly enough, yet it ends in blank spaces that echo with unanswered questions. Generations later, the cavern still carries their absence. Visitors walk its lit paths on guided tours, unaware of how much remains unexplored beyond the safety lines. For those who know the tale, every darkened passage feels like a reminder of the men who stepped forward, measured their way into the unknown, and never returned to tell what they found. Colossal Cavern keeps its silence, leaving only the chilling thought that somewhere within its endless miles of stone, the Surveyors' final steps are still hidden in darkness. The gas deaths of Flint Ridge. Flint Ridge carried a reputation that stretched across Kentucky long before tragedy gave it a darker meaning. Known for its vast system of limestone corridors, the ridge was celebrated for both its beauty and its scale, rivaling even the nearby Mammoth cave in scope. To many it was a marvel of nature, a place where the earth seemed to open itself and reveal hidden kingdoms of stone. Yet within those same passages, invisible dangers gathered silently, and in time, the cavern would be remembered not for its grandeur but for the lives it quietly claimed. Among its sprawling corridors, visitors often marvelled at the unusual stillness of the air. Unlike caves where breezes whispered through connecting tunnels, Flint Ridge often felt sealed, its chambers heavy with stagnant silence. Lantern flames burned low without warning, and in places voices carried oddly as if the air itself was thick. The quiet weight of the atmosphere became one of its most unsettling features, a warning that few understood until it was too late. What made the site treacherous was not shifting rock or sudden water, but the unseen presence of gases seeping into the chambers. Miners and guides alike noted the strange heaviness that settled in certain passages, though few could explain its cause. The cavern was not only deep but layered with pockets that trapped air, creating spaces where a single step could take a person from safety into suffocation. Unlike dangers that shouted their arrival, this one crept forward in silence, claiming those who did not realize they were already surrounded. The first signs of disaster appeared in the accounts of workers who explored Flint Ridge in the 19th century. Men who entered healthy and alert staggered out pale and shaking, describing dizziness, pounding in the head, and a sudden inability to breathe. Some collapsed before they could reach the surface, their bodies dragged out by fellow workers who spoke of air that felt dead and heavy. These early incidents were whispered about more than written, yet their memory lingered as warnings passed quietly from one generation to the next. Witnesses later recalled the most haunting incident, a small group of men entering one of the deeper chambers, confident in their knowledge of the passages, only to fail to return. Rescuers who followed described finding them lying as if asleep, lanterns still burning faintly nearby, their faces calm but drained of life. The lack of struggle made the scene unnerving, for it seemed as though death had come with such quiet swiftness that none of them had time to cry out. No sound of falling rock or rushing water marked their final moments. There was no cave-in to explain the loss, no storm flooding through hidden tunnels. Instead, the cavern itself seemed to close around them in silence, not explain the lifeless air. Those who recovered the bodies spoke of their own weakness as they entered the same chamber, describing the sensation of lungs refusing to fill, no matter how deeply they tried to breathe. Investigators noted the unsettling nature of these deaths, recording them not as accidents of stone but as suffocation without cause. The lack of visible danger made the ridge both feared and fascinating, for here was a cave that killed without lifting a finger. Reports described the possibility of gases, though few could determine whether it was carbon dioxide pooling in low places or some other mixture rising from hidden fissures. The science of cave atmospheres was poorly understood, and so the explanation remained uncertain, leaving space for rumour to take root. Families of the victims grieved with little comfort, for there was no villain to name, no collapsing wall or flood to blame. Instead, their loss came from something unseen, an enemy impossible to confront. To them, the cavern became a place that mocked human fragility, turning the most ordinary act, breathing, into the cause of death. Funerals were marked not by anger but by a heavy sorrow, the kind that came from facing something vast and unknowable. As news spread beyond the local community, Flint Ridge's name carried both awe and dread. Articles described it as a labyrinth filled with silent killers, where men entered strong and left still and cold. Tourists who once sought to marvel at its passages began to arrive out of morbid curiosity, eager to stand in the same chambers where lives had been extinguished. The cave's reputation grew, less as a wonder of geology and more as a tomb without walls. Warnings were issued to guides and visitors alike, urging caution and preparation. Lanterns were tested for signs of weak flames, and animals were sometimes brought along as living detectors, their unease serving as an early alarm. Yet even these measures could not guarantee safety, for the gases shifted without pattern, appearing where they had never been before and disappearing from places long feared. The unpredictability made the ridge a place where every step carried the weight of uncertainty. Still, curiosity endured, for the draw of the underground was stronger than fear. Guides continued to lead tours, though with growing unease, and researchers pressed deeper in search of discoveries. The glitter of mineral walls and the thrill of charting unknown corridors outweighed the warnings for many, though each descent carried with it the risk of not returning. The cavern became a test of courage as much as an object of study, luring those who believed they could outwit the dangers of the air. Researchers who returned after tragedies often brought instruments to measure the quality of the air. Their accounts spoke of chambers where oxygen levels dropped so low that flame extinguished instantly, and where breathing became laboured within moments. They described invisible boundaries that could be crossed unknowingly, dividing one chamber of safe air from another filled with suffocating gas. Though their efforts brought understanding, they also confirmed the lingering peril that no human effort could remove entirely. Some pointed to natural gas pockets released by the shifting of stone as the cause. The ridge, with its complex geology, was thought to hide reservoirs that seeped slowly into the caverns. According to this view, the deaths were the result of nature's hidden vents, unpredictable and unstoppable, lying in wait for anyone who stepped too close. Others argued the cavern itself created its own poison. They believed the air, trapped and unmoving in the deep recesses, became exhausted of its life-giving qualities. In this telling, Flint Ridge suffocated its visitors not through invasion from outside sources, but through the slow and inevitable decay of its own atmosphere. Either way, the result was the same, a space where survival depended on luck as much as caution. Even with explanations, the sense of mystery refused to vanish. Families still spoke of the cavern as cursed, and guides warned in hushed tones that the ridge chose who could pass. Science explained the mechanics, but it could not soothe the unease of standing in a place where the air itself had been the killer. The intangible nature of the danger gave it a presence that facts could not erase. Generations later, the memory of those deaths remained etched into the history of Flint Ridge. Stories passed from guide to guide, retold with a mix of reverence and fear. The names of the lost faded with time, yet the manner of their passing remained unforgettable, tied to the very identity of the ridge. Each retelling renewed the cave's reputation, ensuring that its silence carried not only wonder, but also warning. The silence of Flint Ridge became its most haunting feature. Visitors described the way footsteps seemed swallowed by the walls, and how breaths sounded louder than they should. In that stillness, the memory of those who perished seemed to linger, as though their final gasps remained suspended in the stagnant air. The absence of sound became a presence in itself, heavy and impossible to ignore. Some visitors swear they feel lightheaded the moment they enter, even in the safest chambers. They describe faint dizziness, a sudden cold sweat, or the unnerving sense that the air has thickened around them. Whether born of imagination or trace amounts of lingering gas, the sensations continue to unsettle those who pass through, keeping the fear of the ridge alive. Yet the question remains whether the cavern still holds its silent danger, or whether memory has become the stronger force. The deaths are real, their causes partially explained, but the atmosphere of Flint Ridge carries a weight that no study can lift. It is a place where every inhalation carries a reminder of the invisible, and where each breath feels borrowed. Those who linger too long in its depths cannot help but wonder if the air around them is still, at that very moment, choosing who will walk out again. The lantern that led astray in Mammoth Dome. A faint glow marked the start of the descent into Mammoth Dome, a chamber so vast that voices drifted upward and never seemed to return. Visitors often described the place as overwhelming, its sheer scale making them feel like insects within a cathedral of stone. The small circle of light from a lantern was almost laughable against such immensity, yet it was all that explorers had to pierce the layers of darkness that swallowed the floor and ceiling alike. Shadows lengthened across the jagged walls, stretching like silent warnings each time the lantern flame quivered. For those entering Mammoth Dome, the flame became not just a tool but a companion, a fragile guardian against the weight of blackness pressing from every direction. The uncertainty of where the shadows ended and where the stone began created a sense of unease, as though the cavern itself were playing tricks on the eyes. The lantern's flame wavered, casting brief glimpses of pathways that led nowhere. At certain angles, passages appeared to branch outward, yet when followed they revealed only blank walls or sudden drops into unseen depths. The unreliability of vision in such a place was notorious, and many early accounts warned of the dangers of trusting light that flickered too quickly or cast double images across uneven rock. Beyond the circle of light, the caverns swallowed every outline, leaving only an emptiness that felt alive. The human mind, starved of detail, filled the void with imagined forms, moving figures, faint doors, even staircases that seemed to rise only until the lantern drew closer and revealed flat stone. This play between glow and shadow fueled whispers among travellers who believed the dome was enchanted, that the flame not only revealed but also deceived. Each step deeper brought the unsettling illusion of movement just outside the glow. Some explorers swore they saw shapes gliding across the edges of vision, retreating whenever the lantern was raised. Others insisted that a second light had appeared in the distance, swaying as though another traveller were guiding the way, only to vanish when pursued. These claims grew so common that the legend of a false lantern became part of the oral history surrounding Mammoth Dome. Light reflected strangely from mineral surfaces, hinting at doorways that did not exist. Bands of crystal caught the flame and returned it as ghostly glimmers on far-off walls, luring explorers toward corners that had no exit. Even experienced guides could be misled, convinced that an opening lay ahead, only to find themselves against cold stone with no path forward. The constant redirection of sight created a maze that shifted not in structure but in perception. Darkness seemed alive, pressing closer whenever the lantern dimmed. The faint hiss of a weakening wick could send panic through even seasoned travellers, for once the light failed there was no reliable way to regain a sense of direction. The floor sloped in subtle ways that could lead to a misstep into deep chasms, and the vastness of the dome made a single voice sound as if it came from a dozen directions at once. When the lantern suddenly flared, figures appeared where no one stood. The tricks of sudden brightness played cruelly on the imagination, painting tall, thin shadows that seemed to watch from a distance. Accounts told of men shouting in alarm when they thought a stranger had entered the chamber, only to realize the phantom was nothing but their own outline stretched against rock. Yet doubt lingered in their retellings, as though some were not entirely certain what they had seen. The glow revealed markings on the stone, though no one agreed on what they showed. Some claimed they were tool marks left by ancient hands, others argued they were natural mineral veins, and a few insisted they resembled writing too worn to read. Each interpretation seemed to depend on how the lantern tilted, for what looked like symbols in one moment dissolved into rough scratches when the flame shifted. At the cavern's lowest point the flame sputtered and silence rushed in like a tide. There were stories of groups who paused to adjust their light, only to realize one member had wandered off, drawn toward a shimmer that no longer existed. Voices called into the dark often came back distorted, stretched by echoes that gave the impression of answers. Such moments deepened the fear that Mammoth Dome did not merely confuse but actively misled those within it. Some guides told of a night when a lantern appeared high along the walls, where no one could have stood. The light moved as though carried in an unseen hand, tracing a deliberate path before vanishing into blackness. Searchers scoured the ledges and found no footprints, no rope, no evidence of human presence. The incident left them shaken, for no natural explanation accounted for a moving light in a place so difficult to reach. Others described the way the false glow could lure travellers upward onto precarious ledges. The stone rose in steep slopes that seemed to promise a new chamber just beyond, yet often ended abruptly at a sheer drop. Survivors recalled pulling companions back from the brink after they stepped forward, in pursuit of what looked like another lantern shining just ahead. Each of these escapes fed the belief that the dome harboured something that sought to draw explorers into danger. Legends grew that the lantern was not a tool at all, but a trick of the cavern itself. Stories passed from guide to visitor spoke of the dome as a place where light lost its loyalty, serving the cavern's will rather than the hand that carried it. Some even whispered that the false glow belonged to those who had vanished in earlier expeditions, their lost flames still wandering the heights and depths, repeating their final paths forever. Though skepticism persisted, the reports did not vanish. Newspapers occasionally published brief mentions of strange lights within Mammoth Dome, and locals spoke of the place with caution. The stories rarely aligned in detail, but they all shared one element: the lantern that led astray, promising safety or discovery, only to dissolve into nothing at the crucial moment. In time, the legend of the false lantern became inseparable from the identity of Mammoth Dome itself. Travellers arrived not only to marvel at its size, but also to test whether they too might glimpse the shifting glow. Some left convinced they had seen it, others claimed they had not, but nearly all departed with unease, remarking on how quickly their own lanterns seemed to falter within the cavern's depths. Even today, questions remain about what truly occurs in the vast shadows of Mammoth Dome, where one fragile flame can guide or betray with equal ease. The Horse Cave Digging Disaster. In the early hours of a humid Kentucky morning, work began at a site just beyond the edges of the town of Horse Cave. The cave had long been a place of local curiosity, known for its yawning mouth that opened directly beneath the town itself, a shadow-filled entrance that carried both promise and dread. On that day, men gathered with tools and lanterns, tasked with widening an access route that would allow deeper exploration and possible development. The air was filled with the sound of iron striking stone, each blow echoing with the confidence of routine labour. At the dig site, tension simmered beneath the rhythm of work. The cavern's walls seemed steady at first, holding their weight in silence, but the earth was restless. The men spoke little as they dug, their words lost in the ringing of metal and the rasp of shovels pushing soil aside. Every movement stirred dust that clung to the lantern light, casting the workers into a haze where outlines blurred and shadows stretched unnaturally across the rock. Dust clung to the workers as the morning deepened, coating their hair and settling in their lungs with every breath. Lantern flames flickered in the clouded air, wavering as if disturbed by more than just the movement of men. Those who laboured nearest the opening could still feel faint currents of outside air, but deeper inside the air thickened and pressed upon them, warning of the cavern's unstable temperament. Shovels struck rock with a rhythm that began to sound less like progress and more like a drumbeat marking time. Each strike reverberated through the cavern floor, carrying the suggestion that something below was stirring. What had been considered ordinary stone began to sound hollow in places, a warning that some of the ground held more emptiness than solidity. Yet the digging continued, for the task was clear and the hours pressed forward. What began as routine labour soon bent toward unease. The floor beneath their boots shifted subtly, and fine cracks crept like veins across the walls. Some workers paused, sensing that the ground itself was listening, but silence brought no answers, only the weight of expectation. There was talk of stopping, but hesitation fell away beneath the orders to press on, to finish the work that had already begun. Cracks in the earth widened without warning, and a low groan rolled through the chamber, startling even the most seasoned men. The ground trembled, a warning that came too late. In one shattering instant, the cavern's stability collapsed. Dust erupted in choking clouds, lanterns toppled, and stone fell in sheets that buried shovels, tools, and men beneath a crushing weight. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, broken only by the desperate cries of those still alive. Eyewitnesses later described the collapse as a living thing, a force that surged downward rather than simply falling. Survivors spoke of the air rushing out as if the cave itself exhaled, extinguishing flames and plunging them into absolute blackness. Some escaped through narrow passages, their bodies torn and lungs seared with dust, but others vanished where the ceiling had caved, their shouts cut short beneath tons of rock. The roar of falling stone continued long after the first collapse, echoing into chambers no one could reach. When townspeople above ground heard the muffled thunder, they rushed to the site, finding only a gaping wound in the earth where men had once stood. Panic swept through the crowd as families cried out for loved ones trapped below, their voices carrying into a silence that offered no reply. For hours, rescuers struggled to push into the blocked passages, their efforts slowed by unstable rock that shifted dangerously with each strike of the pick. The air grew heavier the deeper they tried to move, filled with dust and the sour smell of damp stone. Every attempt threatened to trigger another collapse, and yet they pressed forward, listening desperately for any sound that might guide them to the trapped men. Hope dwindled with each passing moment as cries from the buried workers faded into silence. The rescuers knew that even if pockets of air had remained, the choking dust and lack of breathable space gave little chance of survival. Still, they dug on, refusing to abandon the effort even as their own strength failed beneath the weight of despair. Official accounts noted the scale of the disaster in careful, measured words. Reports in local papers spoke of an accident of grave consequence, listing names of the missing while avoiding the fuller horror of what had been witnessed. Between the lines of print lay the sorrow of families left waiting for bodies that would never be recovered, their grief sealed in stone with the cavern itself. Attempts to reach survivors failed repeatedly, and after days of digging the rescue effort slowed. Each strike into the rock only deepened the danger, and soon even the bravest admitted that the cave had claimed what it would not return. The site was left as a memorial of sorts, an unmarked grave beneath the earth, holding those who had entered with faith in their work and never came back. Local superstition claimed the cave had warned the men that the groaning earth and shifting dust were not natural signs but deliberate ones. Stories spread of lanterns flickering when no draught could be found, of voices carried through stone as if the cavern spoke its own refusal. Some whispered that the cave demanded lives for every attempt to carve it wider, an exchange sealed in the darkness that no human will could change. Decades after the disaster, the town of Horse Cave carried the memory in uneasy silence. Children grew up hearing the story not from books, but from the sorrow of elders who remembered the morning when the earth swallowed their neighbours whole. Some avoided the cave entirely, unwilling to test its temper, while others visited its mouth in quiet awe, standing at the edge of a void that seemed alive with hidden judgment. What lingers is the darkness itself, as if the cave still listens for the echo of shovels that will never strike stone again. The frozen Niagara disappearance. Glittering walls of stone drew travellers toward frozen Niagara, where stalactites and curtains of calcite fell in waves like frozen water. The chamber seemed alive, an enormous cascade captured mid-motion, its mineral folds gleaming as though time had stopped inside the rock. Visitors lingered beneath its towering formations, often struck silent by a beauty that seemed less natural than conjured. Awe and unease coexisted here, for the frozen cascade carried a grandeur that looked both fragile and eternal, as though it might collapse at the slightest sound, or endure longer than memory itself. Light striking the formations created illusions, transforming the chamber into something resembling glass palaces of legend. Lanterns and early electric bulbs cast gold across the translucent curtains, their glow deepening into indigo shadows that disappeared into crevices no guide dared approach. Every flicker of flame altered the cave's appearance, shifting its ridges and drapery folds into ghost-like shapes that seemed to breathe. To some, the changing light was enchanting. To others, it gave the place an uncanny presence, as though the walls themselves moved when no one looked directly at them. It was within this dreamlike place that the first hints of unease appeared, whispers of someone who entered and did not return. A tour would conclude with laughter, but a name remained unanswered during roll call. Sometimes it was a casual explorer, at other times a labourer assisting with improvements. Their absence was not immediately alarming. Caves could distract and confuse, and perhaps someone had taken a side passage or wandered back along the trail. Yet when hours passed without return, and the chamber grew colder with the waiting, the suspicion of something more permanent began to take hold. Guides spoke of sudden absences, footsteps fading between chambers without sound or trace. They described how the formations could disorient even seasoned workers, hiding openings behind folds of stone that resembled solid walls. To lose one's bearings in a place so complex was not unusual, but what struck the witnesses was how completely these individuals seemed to vanish. Searchers reported no echo of calls, no lantern flicker in the distance, no scuff marks along the trail. It was as if the cave itself had consumed the missing. Patterns in the stone seemed to play tricks on the eye, hiding gaps that looked like shadows until it was too late. Some visitors claimed that frozen Niagara contained more hidden pockets than any other chamber, its curtain-like shapes concealing narrow slots of darkness where a person could slip and never be noticed. These illusions carried a danger unlike simple darkness, for they suggested passage where none existed and concealed routes where safety should have been visible. Those who studied the formations began to suspect that the grandeur of the cavern also acted as its most dangerous trap. Some believed the beauty itself was deceptive, masking dangers that could draw the unwary deeper than they intended. The glitter of calcite distracted attention from uneven floors, sudden drops, or narrow crevices just wide enough for a misstep. A visitor might lean too close to admire a translucent fold and find the ground giving way beneath them, or turn to follow what appeared to be an opening only to discover themselves enclosed by stone. For all its loveliness, frozen Niagara inspired a subtle mistrust, as though admiration was precisely the moment when peril struck. Names etched in ledgers carried no exit marks, each one a reminder that the cave kept count even when no body was found. Records of guided tours sometimes listed guests whose departures were never confirmed, though the exact circumstances blurred over time. In a few cases, inquiries were raised, but no evidence ever materialized to prove where the individuals had gone. The missing were not always prominent enough to draw lasting attention, yet their absence echoed through the staff who recalled the silence after the tours ended. It was one thing to misplace a hat or lantern in the cave, another entirely to misplace a life. The surrounding silence carried a strange weight, not the hollow emptiness of other caverns, but something heavier, almost watchful. Those who remained in the chamber after a disappearance often described the quiet as unnatural, a stillness that pressed against their ears until whispers seemed amplified. The sound of dripping water grew sharp, magnified as though the cave itself was listening. In such silence, the possibility of unseen presence became difficult to ignore, and many left with the impression that the missing had not merely wandered, but been absorbed into a silence that never released them. Rumours spread through nearby towns, claiming the rockfall curtains were a veil into places unseen. Stories of hidden tunnels, secret rivers, and chambers beyond the reach of guides took root, each attempting to explain how a person could vanish so completely in a space so carefully charted. Some speculated that openings existed behind the calcite folds, passageways only accessible at certain angles or under certain lights, their entrances indistinguishable from shadow until crossed. Whether these rumours had any truth mattered less than the way they persisted, keeping the fear alive long after official searches ended. Guides warned of the shifting paths, though their cautions could not explain why certain explorers vanished so completely. Lantern light distorted distances, making safe ground appear treacherous and steep inclines appear level. A moment's misjudgment could lead to a fall into blackness, yet such an accident should have left some trace. The absence of broken lanterns, discarded equipment, or even footprints raised questions that no warning could answer. What troubled the guides most was not that people went missing, but that they seemed to dissolve into the cave with nothing left behind. Stories clung to the chamber like mist, tales of voices heard beyond the stone, calling faintly yet impossible to follow. Some insisted they had heard their names whispered in the dark. Others spoke of distant shouts carried by echoes that refused to resolve into direction. Searchers often followed these sounds only to find themselves circling back, the supposed cries leading them deeper into confusion. Whether imagination or trick of acoustics, the effect was the same, the sense that the missing were still near, just beyond reach, forever out of sight. Descriptions left behind grew vague, filled with conflicting details that made it impossible to know the last known steps of the missing. One witness might recall seeing someone pause near the largest calcite curtain, another remembered them turning toward a narrow side alcove, while yet another swore they had left the chamber entirely. The lack of agreement suggested the cave's illusions were stronger than human certainty, erasing clarity even as events unfolded. Without consistent testimony, the search for answers became a labyrinth of contradictions. Time blurred the certainty, yet the sense of something unresolved never faded. Years passed, tours continued, and improvements brought safer lighting and sturdier walkways, but the story of those who disappeared beneath frozen Niagara lingered like an unseen presence. Guides mentioned it in hushed tones, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a reluctant admission that beauty had a cost. Though visitors admired the spectacle, many felt an undercurrent of unease, as if standing too long in the chamber might invite the same fate. Those who returned spoke of strange visions, shapes flickering at the edge of lantern light, as though the cave itself imitated movement. These visions often carried the impression of company, a figure just out of reach, a shadow that vanished when pursued. Some wondered if these apparitions were the cave's way of preserving memory, or if they were simply tricks of perception born of exhaustion. Whatever the explanation, the sensation was unsettling enough that few lingered willingly in the chamber once the tours ended. Frozen Niagara remained a paradox, admired for its beauty yet feared for the silence that followed certain disappearances. Its formations drew countless visitors, each dazzled by the illusion of a waterfall frozen in time, yet beneath the admiration lay a persistent unease. The cave invited wonder but offered no assurances, leaving every visitor to wonder if they too might step into the same mystery that claimed others. The frozen curtain still gleams in lantern light, dazzling to the eye while concealing whatever truth lies beyond it. The hidden chamber of Mammoth Cave. Talk spread of a concealed passage among guides and locals, suggesting that the cave held more than its known chambers revealed. The idea was neither new nor easy to silence, for Mammoth Cave had always inspired stories of chambers beyond reach, places spoken of with hushed certainty even when no proof could be offered. At certain bends, the air seemed to move strangely, as though carried from spaces unseen beyond the mapped tunnels. Drafts that had no visible source chilled the skin and unsettled those who paused long enough to feel them. To some, these were the surer signs of a greater hollow nearby, hidden just beyond the barrier of stone. Some explorers traced faint carvings along the rock, markings that hinted at paths leading to places not shown on official surveys. While scholars often dismissed these as tool marks left behind by miners or surveyors, others believed they belonged to an older tradition, a map of sorts meant to guide toward a place that was never recorded. Others recalled sudden drafts, gusts of cool air rushing through seams in the wall where no opening was visible. Each such encounter gave rise to speculation that entrances had once existed but were later sealed, whether by collapse or by deliberate effort. The possibility of deliberate concealment drew as much fascination as fear, for it suggested knowledge that was not meant to be lost but guarded. The idea of a hidden chamber gained force, for each story added weight to the possibility that a secret still lay beneath the surface. As accounts multiplied, what began as a scattering of observations grew into a body of lore, difficult to dismiss even by those who demanded evidence. The absence of discovery only seemed to sharpen the hunger to find it. During long nights of speculation, searchers spoke of sealed corridors or collapsed entrances masking entire worlds of stone. They described their findings in lantern light, voices low, wondering if the cave itself shifted in ways that obscured what once had been open. Each retelling carried the same refrain: there was more here than the eye could see. Every investigation brought its own contradictions, with clues that pointed toward discovery yet always dissolved into uncertainty. A passage that promised continuation would narrow into impassable fissures. An echo that suggested a vast space ahead would fall silent when followed. What seemed near at one moment receded into impossibility at the next. Those who ventured furthest into the darkness reported sounds, echoes that did not match the known chamber's layout. Sharp returns bounced back as if from unseen walls, while other echoes rolled on into depths no explorer could reach. The auditory map of the cave hinted at rooms that had no visible doorways. Fragments of testimony suggested multiple entrances, each one vanishing into impassable stone before reaching any destination. Some spoke of side passages that narrowed and fell away, others of chasms too wide to cross that seemed to guard paths beyond. None of these accounts aligned perfectly, but together they formed a picture of incompleteness, a cave system that refused to show all of itself. As the years passed, the hidden chamber became legend, but one laced with enough detail to trouble even the skeptics. Guides repeated the stories to visitors, sometimes as entertainment, sometimes with an edge of conviction that revealed their own doubts. What began as a rumour hardened into tradition, and tradition is difficult to erase. Even officials tasked with dismissing the rumours admitted, in quieter moments, that unexplored pockets might remain untouched. Mammoth Cave is vast beyond measure, its known miles only a fraction of its total spread. The thought that chambers still lay undiscovered was less far-fetched than the hope that the entire system had already been charted. On rare occasions, the searchers emerged shaken, speaking of hollow reverberations behind walls that should have been solid. These were not the frightened tales of novices, but the measured words of those who knew the cave intimately, people not prone to exaggeration. The unease in their voices lent gravity to the reports. In their silence afterward, the suggestion lingered that some discoveries resisted being shared. Whether from fear, reverence, or simple uncertainty, not every finding was recorded, and not every rumour was pursued to its end. The cave seemed to keep secrets even from those who wished to reveal them. Maps were redrawn again and again, yet each revision left blank spaces no one could account for. Survey lines looped and overlapped, creating a picture that looked complete but felt unfinished. The absence of finality became its own form of presence, a shadow that no cartographer could erase. What drove the mystery forward was not proof, but the way absence itself seemed to shape the cave's story. Every silence, every draft, every hollow note struck upon stone became a clue that something lay concealed. The hidden chamber lived not in discovery, but in the possibility of discovery. Legends carried by neighbouring communities spoke of travellers who entered the cave centuries ago and never emerged, their absence leaving families and neighbours in lasting uncertainty. Tales described faint glimpses of figures disappearing behind unseen walls or strange sounds echoing from chambers that were supposedly blocked. Some recalled the footprints of lost wanderers fading into dust where no corridor should exist, as if the cave itself had swallowed them without a trace. Over generations, these stories mingled with the practical accounts of explorers and guides, adding a layer of fear and fascination to the search for hidden passageways. The combination of history, folklore, and unexplained traces gave the chamber an almost living presence, a place that existed not only in stone but in the memory of those who never dared to enter. No announcement ever confirmed the chamber, but neither did the talk fade. Guides still repeat the tales, explorers still search for clues, and visitors still peer into the darkness, hoping to glimpse a path unseen. The hidden chamber remains less a place than a question, one that refuses to close. Today, the notion of that hidden chamber remains, suspended between rumour and reality. No wall has yet opened to reveal it, yet no silence has been strong enough to bury it. And so the cave waits, holding within its depths a possibility that refuses to disappear. And in that waiting, the stone seems to guard not emptiness, but the shape of a chamber no one has yet entered. The Carter Caves collapse. Tremors shivered through the earth beneath Carter Caves, faint at first but building with an unnerving persistence that no one inside could ignore. The guides paused mid-step, lanterns held aloft, as the caverns seemed to breathe around them, a hidden world suddenly reminding its visitors of its ancient indifferent power. The walls, damp and slick, reflected the flickering light in strange distorted patterns, and every sound, drop of water, scrape of rock, echoed with new menace. Those present could feel the shift in the ground, subtle at first, then unmistakable, as if the cave itself had decided to awaken. Shadows flickered across the walls, cast by lanterns swaying in unsteady hands. Each step taken seemed heavier than the last, as though gravity itself were inconsistent in these narrow corridors. Guides whispered instructions that were half lost in the cavern's deepening murmur, their words barely carrying across spaces that suddenly felt larger, yet more confining. The tourists, drawn by the promise of wonder, now sensed an underlying tension in the air, a pulse that was not their own, but something older and implacable. A sudden rumble echoed through the cave, low at first and then rising in volume, vibrating through stone and bone alike. Pebbles tumbled from the ceiling as if the cave were coughing off centuries of sediment, a warning ignored at one's peril. Every person inside froze, the sound cutting through curiosity and fascination like a knife, leaving only instinctive fear. In the deeper passages, where the lanterns struggled to illuminate, the rumble became a chorus of warning, each note a harbinger of potential collapse. Footsteps faltered as the guides tried to maintain calm, the uneven floor shifting underfoot. Rocks shifted and ground together, whispering threats that no human voice could repeat. Directions that had seemed reliable moments before now led into uncertainty, and the map of the caverns offered little comfort in the face of a world that had changed in minutes. Panic stirred quietly among the group, hearts racing against the cave's slow, inexorable movement. Dust rose in thick clouds, catching the lantern light and turning the air into a haze where shapes became impossible to distinguish. Every inhalation carried grit, burning throats and stinging eyes, adding a physical reminder of the danger they faced. Movements became cautious yet hurried, a strange contradiction that left even the most experienced guides guessing at how to navigate safely through the thickening gloom. Voices called out, strained and anxious, trying to find one another amidst the growing chaos. The sound carried oddly in the cavern, distorted by the irregular passages and the uneven surfaces of rock. Some calls returned as echoes, altered and almost alien, creating a sense that more than just people were moving in the shadows. Each shout reminded those inside that communication could be fleeting and unreliable, that the cavern could claim even attention as it claimed space. Stalactites trembled overhead, sending tiny showers of pebbles and dust to the floor below. In places where light barely reached, fissures appeared along ceilings and walls, thin at first, then widening as unseen forces pushed from beneath. Every crack was a reminder that the cave was alive with pressures and tensions beyond immediate comprehension, a natural cathedral harbouring danger in its silent beauty. Water dripped faster from the rock above, finding new channels and pooling where it had not before. The slow seep became a warning of subterranean shifts, a sign that even unseen forces were in motion. Guides noted the change, knowing that water could both signal and accelerate instability, a dual threat that added to the tension building among the explorers. A cavern wall groaned with sudden intensity, splintering the silence as if the cave itself had inhaled and exhaled in anger. The sound made hearts leap and minds race. Even those accustomed to the murmurs and groans of caves recognized a new, urgent note in the symphony of geological movement. The caverns spoke in a language few understood, but all could feel. Lantern-light quivered against walls now streaked with dust and tiny fractures, casting flickering images that seemed alive. Every shadow could hide a shifting rock, every reflection could deceive the eye. The guide's attempts to illuminate the safest paths became a race against time, against a landscape that could change in the instant it was studied. Equipment clattered to the floor as hands slipped, shovels and measuring tools abandoned in panic. The sounds, metallic and startling, joined the chorus of rumbling stone, each clang a punctuation in the escalating chaos. Those who had come prepared were now fighting instinct, trying to move with purpose while the cave's slow collapse dictated the pace. Darkness pressed in, suffocating and absolute, as the ceiling shuddered in violent pulses. Passages that moments ago seemed navigable now appeared treacherous, their edges blurred by dust and shadow. The cave's layout, memorized by guides and surveyed by experts, became irrelevant under the immediacy of danger, replaced by the elemental demand to survive. Survivors huddled together where the ground seemed most stable, lanterns clutched like lifelines. Their breaths came fast and shallow, each inhalation a reminder of the limited oxygen and the uncertainty surrounding them. No one knew which walls would hold and which would give way. Each second was a gamble in a game the cavern controlled entirely. Rock dust coated every surface, transforming familiar corridors into alien terrain. Footprints and handprints were swallowed quickly, erased by falling debris and drifting silt. The path they had entered through seemed almost a memory, the environment reshaping itself in response to pressures unseen. Every person inside realized that the cave was not static, but an active participant in the unfolding disaster. Emergency calls rang out from deeper chambers, their echoes lost long before reaching the surface. The sounds were a fragile lifeline, faint and unreliable, barely bridging the distance between the trapped and those who might aid them. In the cavern, the attempts at communication were almost ceremonial, acts of hope that the walls could ignore entirely. Silence returned unevenly, a deceptive calm after the worst of the collapse. It pressed on the survivors, a reminder that the cave could hold its breath as well as its fury. In that silence, every minor sound was amplified, from a whisper to the smallest tumble of rock, ensuring that vigilance could never fully rest. Investigators later pieced together the disaster, tracing shifts in rock and subtle signs of instability to understand how the collapse occurred. Reports from 1963 documented the events in Carter Cave's State Resort Park, emphasizing how quickly disaster could unfold when the immense pressures of nature intersected with human activity. Even with modern understanding, the cavern's behavior remained enigmatic, a reminder of the unpredictability of underground spaces. The map of Carter Caves would never be the same. Areas once considered secure were re-evaluated, passages that had seemed stable now marked with warnings. Surveyors and guides alike recognised the fragility of the underground world, understanding that even long-established routes carried hidden risks. The cave's interior became both a subject of study and a cautionary tale for those who would enter. Memories lingered among those who survived, vivid with the sounds, tremors and glimpses of falling rock. Even decades later, the moments before the collapse were recounted with detail, each retelling emphasizing the suddenness, the unpredictability, and the quiet horror of stone giving way. The cave's story was carried by those who lived to tell it, a legacy encoded in experience rather than text. Legacies were written in stone dust, marking both the tragedy and the resilience of those who faced it. The events in Carter Caves became a permanent chapter in Kentucky's geological history, a reminder that beneath serene landscapes, the earth moves with powers beyond human comprehension. It stood as a warning that every cavern, however familiar, holds its secrets and its dangers. Silence lingers in the collapsed chambers, humming with the memory of shifting stone and the echoes of human presence, as if the cave waits to remind the world of its hidden might. The Bell's Tavern tragedy. Thunder rolled across the hills surrounding Bell's Tavern, carrying with it a sense of unease to those inside. The building, constructed of heavy timbers and local stone, had stood for decades, hosting travellers, locals, and the occasional wanderer seeking warmth on cold nights. On this particular evening in 1873, the tavern's usual bustle masked a growing tension that no one could yet name. The storm outside was only part of the unease. The structure itself seemed to tremble in anticipation, responding to forces that few could perceive. Lantern light flickered along the wooden beams, casting shadows that stretched and twisted across the walls. Patrons seated at long tables paused, noticing how the shadows clung longer than usual, how the darkness seemed to thicken in corners that should have been well lit. The glow from the hearth offered comfort, yet even that warmth felt thin against the weight of the approaching calamity. The timbers groaned faintly, a whisper of strain that passed unnoticed by most but set the edge of alert in the minds of a few experienced travellers. The patrons laughed and spoke, unaware that the walls around them had already begun to tremble with quiet warning. Tankards clinked, and conversations about distant towns and recent harvests filled the room. But beneath the ordinary sounds, an undercurrent of tension threaded through the air. Chairs scraped against the floor, but no one noticed the subtle unevenness beneath them, the boards that had begun to flex against centuries of wear. What seemed like small imperfections hinted at vulnerabilities that would soon become impossible to ignore. A sudden crash echoed from the back room, drawing startled eyes toward the source before any explanation could form. Muffled shouts followed, mingled with the scraping of wood against stone. A few patrons rose, moving toward the noise with cautious curiosity, while others froze in their seats, uncertainty pinning them to the floor. The tavern had endured storms, crowded evenings and minor accidents, but this sound carried a finality that chilled even the bravest souls present. Outside, the wind whipped through the trees, rattling shutters and adding to the tavern's growing tension. Rain lashed against the windows with sharp, rhythmic taps, like tiny hands trying to warn those inside. The howling gusts pushed through gaps in the walls and doors, twisting and lifting the faint smell of wet earth and wood smoke. It was an atmospheric tension that could have been ignored on a quieter night, but paired with the crash from within, it served as a foreboding prelude to the disaster about to unfold. Behind the bar, the keeper moved quickly to calm frightened visitors, his own unease hidden beneath forced smiles. John Bell had inherited the tavern from his father and knew every beam and plank by touch alone, yet even his practiced calm could not hide the way his hands shook when he noticed subtle gaps appearing between floorboards and the faint creaking from the ceiling. He instructed his staff to usher patrons toward the exits, while masking the rising panic in their eyes, though every step toward safety was shadowed by the tavern's ominous groans. From the rafters, a loose beam groaned under its own weight, threatening to give way with the next vibration. Dust drifted downward, invisible yet tangible in the lantern light, settling on tables and patrons alike. The beam had been weakened over decades by moisture and subtle shifts in the foundation, and though unnoticed during ordinary days, tonight it would become the hinge upon which the disaster pivoted. A single additional tremor, imperceptible to most, was all it would take. In the corner, a fiddle played on as if oblivious to the danger, the music strangely discordant against the subtle chaos. The musician, trying to maintain the tavern's usual liveliness, had no notion that his movements and the vibrations from dancing feet added to the tension in the aged timbers. Each note struck the floorboards, resonating faintly through beams that were ready to surrender to the cumulative strain. The music, intended to soothe, instead seemed to punctuate the unsteady rhythm of impending catastrophe. Smoke from the hearth curled upward, mingling with dust and carrying the scent of wood and candle wax that would soon be overwhelmed. The warm haze obscured fine cracks forming in the walls and ceiling, tiny fissures that marked where stone met timber under extreme pressure. Patrons inhaled the familiar scents, oblivious to the silent warnings they carried, a hint of decay, a warning of age and strain that could not be undone. Voices rose in alarm as the first signs of structural collapse appeared, the sound magnified in the enclosed space. The tavern's floor trembled, tables shifting and glasses rattling, while the ceiling above seemed to breathe unevenly. Some patrons rushed for the doors, others stumbled over chairs and each other, and the tavern's interior became a chaotic maze of sound and movement. The collision of panic and architecture created a moment of intense suspense that would define the tragedy. The floor trembled, sending glasses and plates skittering, and the moment of terror became undeniable. Splintering wood fell in small showers as beams cracked, and the air filled with dust that stung eyes and choked lungs. A supporting joist gave way, creating a sudden jagged collapse that swallowed sections of the tavern in darkness. The simultaneous blend of sound, dust, and movement made it impossible to track individual paths, ensuring that even those who survived were left disoriented and terrified. Chaos spread like wildfire as the tavern's patrons sought exits, the confined space amplifying fear and confusion. Screams echoed from corners and corridors, often overlapping to create a cacophony of human distress. Some tried to lift fallen beams to free trapped companions, while others abandoned all restraint in a desperate search for open doors. The room's geometry, once welcoming, now turned against its inhabitants, shaping paths of survival and doom with cruel impartiality. Amid the panic, a single figure froze in the doorway, torn between survival and reaching for a companion. The weight of the collapsing structure pressed upon those inside, forcing instantaneous choices with life or death consequences. Decisions became instinctual rather than rational. Instinct carried some to safety and left others behind. The human element of tragedy was stark, tangible, and impossible to separate from the ruin wrought by the timbers and stone. By the back wall, splintered timber created a hazard no one could anticipate, shaping the tragedy before it fully unfolded. Debris formed irregular barricades that forced individuals to reroute, causing additional collisions and moments of injury. The randomness of the collapse ensured that each person's experience was unique, yet all were linked by the same underlying threat: the tavern's failing structure. Silence fell, after the initial destruction thick and suffocating, holding the weight of what had been lost. Dust settled, leaving a grey haze across broken tables, shattered chairs, and warped floorboards. In the quiet, the echo of screams lingered, carrying with it an unsettling reminder that the event was not merely physical but etched into memory, ready to haunt all who bore witness. The aftermath revealed injuries and devastation, the once lively tavern reduced to broken beams and whispered memories. Villagers and travellers alike gathered at the edges of the site, their eyes tracing the wreckage, unsure whether to grieve, marvel, or recoil. Conversations were fragmented and speculative, recounting who had survived, who had vanished, and which areas had succumbed to the collapse first. The tavern, for generations a hub of communal life, now stood as a monument to unforeseen peril. Even now, the site is remembered in local lore, not only for the tragedy itself but for the sense of vulnerability it imposed on a community. Stories describe the tremors felt beneath boots, the sound of wood straining in the dark, and the sight of dust-filled lantern light that once illuminated laughter but now recalled screams. The memory serves as a warning, a reminder of how quickly familiar spaces can become arenas of danger. Shadows linger among the remnants of the tavern, as if the building itself guards secrets of the night it fell, holding within its fragments both the fear and courage displayed within its walls. Silence now settles, the air heavy with memory, while the broken timbers seemed to wait for the next echo of life. The Echo River drownings. The Echo River has long carried a reputation that casts shadows over the limestone hills of Kentucky. Its waters wind through narrow passages and hidden crevices, carving a network of underground channels that few have dared to explore. Locals speak of sudden surges in the river that appear without warning, and of the eerie silence that follows when a crew ventures too far into the labyrinthine tunnels. In the early decades of the 20th century, these waters were not merely a backdrop for folklore but a deadly presence, claiming those who sought to navigate their hidden depths. In the 1920s, accounts tell of boatmen who guided supplies and explorers through the Echo River's hidden underground channels. They were experienced, skilled in reading the subtle cues of the underground currents, and familiar with the cavern's treacherous turns. Yet, even their expertise could not withstand the river's inexplicable shifts. In 1923, a pair of men set out from a known access point near Horse Cave carrying a small wooden craft. Hours later, the boat was discovered lodged against a jagged wall of stone, the men nowhere to be found. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints in the soft mud along the banks, only the empty vessel bobbing silently in the dim light of the cavern. Such disappearances were not isolated incidents. Over the next several years, multiple crews vanished under similar circumstances. Witnesses on the surface often reported sudden rises in water levels, sometimes without rain or other clear cause. One account details a full complement of 4 men who had embarked on a routine exploration of a side channel. Days later, their boat was found drifting near the mouth of a previously uncharted tunnel, yet none of the men ever emerged. Each incident added layers of fear to the local community, feeding a growing belief that the Echo River was alive in some way, its currents guided by forces beyond human comprehension. Explorers who followed the documented paths of earlier victims described an unsettling consistency in the river's behaviour. Small eddies and whirls appeared where the water should have flowed smoothly, and whispers of air seemed to echo through the caverns without any clear source. Some claimed that the walls themselves appeared to shift subtly, narrowing passages that had been wide moments before. Boats that were carefully tied or anchored sometimes floated free, as if the river had a will of its own, carrying them into shadowed recesses where light could not reach. Investigations by early spelunkers and local authorities produced few answers. Officials from the city of Horse Cave documented several recoveries of empty craft, noting watermarks that suggested sudden and forceful rises in the subterranean waters. Geologists examined the riverbed and surrounding rock, but found nothing to explain the abruptness of the surges. Reports mentioned underwater passages that could fill rapidly due to pressure from higher chambers, yet no measurement could predict the timing or scale of these occurrences. This unpredictability became part of the legend, turning practical exploration into a gamble with unseen currents. Before a disappearance, witnesses occasionally heard sounds that defied explanation. Low, resonant tones echoed through the tunnels, almost like distant drums vibrating against the limestone walls. Some boatmen recalled a subtle change in the air itself, a heaviness that seemed to press down on their chests, as if the river's presence was tangible beyond the rush of water. Those who survived near misses spoke of instinctively turning back, guided by intuition or fear, only to find that those who ignored the warning vanished without trace. Families of the missing often recounted the final known moments of their loved ones, piecing together fragments from brief sightings or letters. In one documented case from 1927, a man named Thomas Hensley wrote to his wife describing the sudden rise of water during a routine trip to map the river's lower channels. He promised to return by nightfall, yet he never did. His boat was recovered days later, empty, resting in a narrow alcove where the current should have been gentle. Letters and local testimonies became echoes themselves, haunting reminders of lives interrupted and swallowed by the dark. Geology gives the Echo River an added layer of intrigue. Limestone walls create natural barriers and traps, forming hidden pockets where water can accumulate and then surge with little warning. Caverns intersect at multiple levels, creating complex vertical channels that can funnel water downward or sideways, sometimes against the expected flow. Explorers who ventured with ropes and lanterns described disorienting labyrinths, passages that seemed to double back on themselves, and chambers where echoes twisted sound into shapes that could confuse even the most seasoned ears. Often hazardous, the rescue operations were carried out only sporadically, Those who attempted to follow missing crews sometimes returned with tales of claustrophobic tunnels, sudden drops into unseen pools, and boats that became wedged in precarious positions, preventing retrieval. One such expedition in 1931 ended when 2 men nearly drowned after misjudging the depth of a submerged passage. Their survival was credited to a last-minute manoeuvre and sheer luck, reinforcing the perception that the river's temperament was as unpredictable as it was lethal. Curiosity persisted around the Echo River, despite the disasters that had occurred there. Adventurers and spelunkers believed that thorough mapping might reveal safe routes or explain the sudden floods, yet few returned with answers. The river seemed to possess a rhythm that defied measurement, a secret pulse that only the vanished had fully experienced. Scholars and local historians have since catalogued these incidents, noting patterns in the location and condition of the empty boats, yet no single explanation has reconciled the disappearances with known natural forces. In modern times, exploration is more cautious, with safety protocols, sonar equipment, and mapping technologies, but the legends endure. The empty boats remain a symbol of the river's unpredictable danger, a reminder that beneath Kentucky's rolling hills and calm streams lies a network of channels that can claim entire crews without leaving a trace. Echoes of past tragedies ripple through each tunnel, mingling with the current in a dance that has fascinated and terrified visitors for generations. Its depths hold silent mysteries, and the Echo River will not always release those who journey too far along its shadowed course. The phantom drums of Sloan's Valley. Rumbling echoed through the stone as if the earth itself had begun a slow, deliberate pulse. The walls of the cavern vibrated beneath the feet of the men, a sensation that set every nerve on edge. No source of the sound could be found, yet each thump seemed to summon them deeper, compelling them to follow the rhythm into darkness where light could barely reach. Shadows clung to jagged rock formations, shifting as if alive, while the drums insisted on a path no eye could trace. Shivers ran along the spines of the crew who had ventured into Sloan's Valley in the spring of 1921. Their mission had been straightforward: survey a newly discovered tunnel system and chart the passageways for future explorers. Yet, within hours, the predictable calm of their task was replaced by an auditory phantom. The first beats were soft, almost imperceptible, bouncing off the walls in irregular patterns. Each subsequent strike grew louder, echoing from multiple directions at once. It became impossible to determine if the sound originated nearby or from the farthest reaches of the cavern. No map could capture the labyrinth's true form. The tunnels twisted and doubled back, walls narrowing and widening without warning. Some passages were tall and vaulted, letting the sound linger like an ominous chant, while others forced the men to crouch, every step amplifying the vibrations through stone and bone alike. One moment the floor was dry and smooth. The next, puddles formed in uneven depressions, reflecting the flickering lanterns and the strange staccato light of a fire long extinguished. Local records mentioned similar phenomena decades earlier. In 1897, a small surveying party reportedly followed mysterious drum beats for hours until they disappeared entirely. The details were scant, but the accounts agreed on one chilling point. The crew had vanished, leaving behind tools and personal items, as if the cavern had swallowed them whole. Oral histories told in nearby towns spoke of ancient miners and hunters who refused to enter the deeper tunnels after hearing the same insistent pounding, describing it as both alluring and terrifying. Fear settled into every heart in the cavern. Men who were normally calm under pressure exchanged glances heavy with unspoken questions. Each thump of the drums was mirrored by the quickening of their pulses. Some claimed that the rhythm matched the beating of their own hearts, a coincidence that felt orchestrated, intentional, as though the underground itself were aware of their presence and chose to toy with their senses. Lantern light trembled, casting elongated shadows that appeared to move independently of the men who held them. Faint tremors ran beneath the explorers' feet. Every step seemed amplified by unseen forces, creating a discordant chorus alongside the drums. Rocks shifted subtly underfoot, releasing tiny avalanches of dust and pebbles that added to the disorienting cacophony. The cavern's air grew heavy, sticky with moisture and the metallic tang of iron, and with every inhalation the men felt more trapped, as if the very atmosphere pressed against them. They could not discern whether the tunnels themselves had changed, or if their own senses were succumbing to the strain of prolonged exposure. Then the sound returned, louder and more insistent, carrying an almost hypnotic cadence. Attempts to track its origin only deepened the mystery. At times it seemed to come from above, then from below, sometimes reverberating directly behind them, despite every effort to advance forward. The echoes layered upon themselves, folding space in ways that defied reason. One man, a surveyor named William Hargrave, reported seeing the light from a lantern shift unexpectedly, as if pulled by the rhythm, casting his own shadow across walls that had been empty moments before. A chill crept from unseen tunnels, snaking along the men's clothing and chilling their skin. Some believed the sound to be a trick of the cavern's acoustics, but acoustic experts later noted that the geometry of Sloan's Valley could not account for the perfectly timed, repetitive thumping that persisted even when the men changed direction. Witnesses described the drums as alive, with qualities more deliberate than random, compelling rather than alarming. Each strike seemed to demand movement, urging explorers toward passages that would ultimately consume them. Whispers of confusion spread among the men. Questions went unanswered as fear eclipsed reason. Attempts to retreat were thwarted by the cavern's deceptive layout. Passages that had been clear moments ago suddenly ended in rock walls or plunged into inky darkness. Those who hesitated or turned back reported hearing the drums intensify, growing closer and more menacing, as though the very stones resented their attempts at retreat. Every choice felt predetermined, every step a negotiation with forces that could neither be seen nor understood. Moments before, the passage had been calm and quiet. Now, it was alive with the resonance of unseen hands striking on stone surfaces. The men instinctively followed, driven by a mixture of curiosity and terror. Each beat was a summons, a rhythm impossible to ignore. Lanterns flickered wildly, shadows leaping across walls that narrowed with each advance. Some explorers described feeling the floor shift beneath them, subtle tremors that coincided with the drum beats, a dangerous dance between sound and movement that made missteps inevitable. Historic accounts provide sparse clarity but confirm repeated disappearances. In 1910, a team of miners followed the sounds into a previously unrecorded chamber. When they failed to return, authorities found their tools abandoned and the entrance partially blocked by fallen stone. Later, one of the miners' boots was discovered hundreds of yards away in a smaller tunnel, with no other trace of the men or their bodies. Such incidents contributed to a fear that the drums themselves were an agent of the cave, a natural but inexplicable phenomenon that had claimed lives for generations. Light fractured across jagged rock, reflecting in shallow pools of water that collected in depressions along the cavern floor. Each reflection distorted the familiar surroundings, turning rock formations into ominous figures that appeared to move in rhythm with the sound. Explorers reported disorientation, unable to determine the direction they had travelled or the proximity of walls. The drum's cadence seemed to warp perception, creating a labyrinthine effect even in sections that were well mapped. Panic became a constant companion, shadowing every cautious advance. No explanation has fully accounted for the phenomenon. Geologists and spelunkers have examined Sloan's Valley extensively, noting its unusual limestone formations and cavernous intersections. Some propose that the vibrations could be amplified subterranean tremors, yet the regularity and persistence of the drumming defied all natural measurements. Each expedition into the tunnels left behind more questions than answers, contributing to a legend that became intertwined with the valley itself. The drums were no longer just sound, they were a presence, a sentinel of the dark. Fear mingled with fascination. Journalists, researchers, and thrill-seekers all ventured into Sloan's Valley at one time or another, hoping to witness the drums firsthand. Few returned with more than fragmented tales, often describing a compulsion so powerful that it overshadowed reason, dragging crews into passages that ended abruptly or collapsed mysteriously. The rhythmic pounding echoed in their memories long after leaving the cavern, a haunting reminder that some forces within the earth are patient and inscrutable. Each discovery of abandoned tools, clothing, or lanterns reinforced the valley's eerie reputation. No signs of struggle accompanied the vanished men, and no discernible pattern explained why one group disappeared while another narrowly escaped. The drums left nothing but emptiness in their wake, a silence punctuated only by memory and echo. Scholars catalogued these incidents, piecing together a chronology that suggested a strange inevitability. Those who heard the first beats were rarely untouched by the valley's influence. Unseen hands seemed to shape the environment itself. Walls that had once appeared stable shifted imperceptibly, forming new channels or narrowing familiar paths. Explorers reported that the cavern seemed to anticipate their movements, responding to hesitation with intensified sounds. The effect was both physical and psychological, creating a maze that could trap even the most careful and experienced spelunker. The drums were the thread that tied every anomaly together, a pulse running through stone and shadow alike. Then, silence fell abruptly, a sudden cessation so complete it startled the senses. Lanterns flickered as if mourning the absence of the sound, leaving explorers disoriented and uncertain. The effect lasted only moments, but it was enough to confirm that the rhythm of the cavern was more than an echo. The drums could cease as suddenly as they began, and in their absence the tunnels became a void where human perception could falter. Each step forward demanded caution, yet the temptation to follow the pulse remained irresistible. Every expedition into Sloan's Valley has left the same question unanswered. Why do the drums exist, and why do they claim those who follow them? Explorers of every generation have documented similar experiences, and yet no single theory has reconciled the evidence. The cavern's reputation has grown with each disappearance, blending documented fact with whispers of the inexplicable. Fear persists, curiosity endures, and the haunting rhythm waits patiently for those who dare enter. The drums continue to echo somewhere in the depths, their source unseen, and the valley remained poised to claim the next crew who followed the impossible rhythm. The Diamond Cavern's gas incident. Haze clung to the cavern floor, drifting in slow currents that seemed almost deliberate. The light from lanterns fell dimly through the suspended dust, refracting against the jagged walls of limestone. Even in the shallow chambers, a sense of suffocation settled over the men, pressing against their lungs as they advanced deeper into the network of tunnels. Every inhale carried the tang of moisture and something faintly metallic, though none could see its source. The air felt heavier with every step, thickening as if the cavern itself resisted intrusion. Movements became cautious, deliberate, almost hesitant, as the men adjusted to the unnatural weight pressing down from above. Conversations slowed to murmurs, broken by coughs that echoed eerily through narrow passageways. The crew, composed of seasoned miners and labourers, was unaccustomed to such oppressive stillness, and an unsettling tension threaded through each moment. Breaths became shallow and uneven as the explorers ventured into a chamber known locally as the Diamond Hall, a space celebrated for its sparkling mineral formations. They had expected beauty and perhaps profit, yet the environment seemed to preempt danger. A chill hung in the cavern, but it was not cold in the traditional sense. It was a penetrating, pervasive sensation, the kind that urged retreat even as curiosity drove them forward. In 1932, a crew of miners had descended into diamond caverns with the intention of charting untested sections and gathering mineral samples. Records from the time indicate that all had been experienced, familiar with the hazards of underground work. Yet the incident that followed defied expectation. Within moments of entering a particularly enclosed chamber, several men collapsed suddenly, their movements halting as if seized by invisible hands. The remaining crew attempted to assist, but confusion and fear spread faster than the men could act. Stalactites dripped silently over stone-enclosed chambers, punctuating the stillness with their slow, deliberate rhythm. The sound, normally considered soothing or neutral, became almost ominous in the oppressive atmosphere. Drips fell onto puddles that reflected distorted light, casting eerie shadows that played across the walls. The miners' lanterns flickered, sending wavering beams that made the chamber seem smaller, tighter, more suffocating with each passing moment. A strange stillness settled over the workers, marking the onset of something unseen. Movements became sluggish. Eyes darted toward the cavern ceiling and walls, as if expecting the invisible to make itself known. None of the instruments the crew carried indicated danger. Barometers remained steady, thermometers showed no extreme temperature, and no tremors were detected. Yet intuition, sharpened by experience, whispered that the very air carried lethal intent. A metallic odour hinted at unseen peril, subtle but unmistakable to those who had spent years underground. It lingered faintly on the tongue and in the back of the throat, a chemical signature that something within the cavern had shifted. Men paused to discuss the unusual smell, yet before any conclusion could be reached, the symptoms began. Dizziness, lightheadedness, an inexplicable nausea that struck without warning. By midday, the air had grown oppressive and unnatural. Those who had felt confident at the entrance now staggered, each step heavier than the last. Conversations devolved into strained groans, the kind that accompany mounting confusion. Attempts to backtrack were frustrated by the labyrinthine structure of the tunnels. Passages that had seemed straightforward now looped unexpectedly, turning familiar paths into disorienting mazes. Panic mingled with physical distress, creating a sense of chaos in the enclosed space. Tools lay scattered across the floor, untouched and ominous. Picks, hammers and lanterns had been dropped in mid-effort, abandoned in sudden fear. The metallic sheen of the stone reflected glimmers of the fallen equipment, amplifying the feeling of desolation. It was as if the cavern had swallowed control, leaving the men's instruments and labour behind in eerie testimony to the invisible force that moved among them. Barometers and gas detectors recorded nothing unusual, yet the atmosphere betrayed them. Technicians who would later examine the event noted the peculiar discrepancy, puzzled that the instruments failed to detect a hazard that proved fatal. The discrepancy became a focal point of the investigation, highlighting the limitations of human observation when confronted with subtle, invisible threats. Shadows gathered unnaturally in the corners of the chamber, as if drawn to the unseen presence. Light seemed to bend away from certain areas, creating pockets of darkness that the men instinctively avoided. Even the most experienced miners hesitated, the air's weight pressing them back from passages that would normally have been routine. Each step became a negotiation with the cavern, every movement fraught with uncertainty. Noise was minimal, yet the silence itself carried menace. The faint sound of breathing seemed amplified, each exhalation echoing with disproportionate intensity. Drops of water from stalactites punctuated the quiet, each ping a reminder of time passing and danger approaching. The cavern seemed patient, indifferent to the human urgency within its walls, allowing fear to build slowly until it dominated reason. Footsteps faltered and then ceased altogether as several men succumbed to the gas. Collapse occurred rapidly, without convulsions or struggle, leaving the remaining crew in stunned disbelief. Attempts to carry or assist those affected only exacerbated confusion and fear, creating chaos that spread faster than any physical hazard could. The chamber became a place of stillness and terror, punctuated by the occasional futile cry for help. A lingering fog formed in the lower recesses, moving with an almost deliberate slowness. It hugged the contours of the floor, curling around rock formations and pooling in depressions. Visibility diminished rapidly as the substance thickened, further disorienting those who remained standing. Even with lamps held high, the men could not see beyond a few feet, making every decision a gamble against unseen danger. Unease extended to the edges of the cavern network. Explorers who later documented the incident noted that gas pockets could shift without warning, moving along fissures and pooling in unexpected areas. The distribution seemed random yet lethal, highlighting the treacherous nature of subterranean exploration. The cavern itself became a silent predator, its threat imperceptible until the moment of impact. Records from local authorities describe recovery efforts as slow and perilous. Teams who entered the tunnels after the incident found the environment unchanged in appearance, yet the evidence of tragedy was unmistakable. Bodies were discovered in positions that suggested sudden incapacity, their expressions frozen in mid-action. Instruments remained functional but meaningless, tools scattered and lanterns extinguished, leaving only the cavern and its invisible threat. Attempts to model the incident scientifically yielded few answers. Experts in geology and occupational safety studied diamond caverns formation, noting limestone fissures and underground chambers that could trap gases, yet no detectable chemical anomaly explained the rapid onset of symptoms. The event became a cautionary tale in occupational studies, demonstrating the limits of human preparation in the face of subtle natural hazards. Time in the cavern seemed elastic, stretching and contracting under the influence of the invisible agent. Minutes and hours merged indistinguishably for those exposed, leaving memory unreliable. Subsequent exploration confirmed that the gas could accumulate silently over hours or emerge suddenly, leaving no external indication of the danger until it had already taken hold. The incident remained a haunting example of the unseen perils that lie beneath Kentucky's hills. Each object left behind, tools, clothing, and lamps, told a story of abrupt interruption. There were no signs of panic beyond the physiological responses, no evidence of struggle or conflict. The cavern had claimed its victims without outward violence, leaving only silence, scattered belongings, and the lingering heavy air. These traces became the enduring testimony of what had occurred, a reminder of danger beyond perception. The Diamond Caverns gas incident remains a chilling record of nature's subtle lethality, its quiet terror etched into the stone and whispered through the corridors by every subsequent visitor who dared enter. The invisible hazard persists in memory, a warning that not all dangers announce themselves with sight or sound. The air in the deepest chambers still shifts in ways no explorer has fully measured. The Cascade Cave suffocations. Wisps of smoke curled against the walls, moving as if guided by unseen fingers, defying every expectation of natural behaviour. The cavern was alive with a strange undulating rhythm, the air thick with particles that clung to skin and clothing. Lantern light danced on the stone surfaces, bending through the haze and creating illusions of movement where none existed. Every inhalation brought a stinging heat that seemed to settle deep in the lungs, a discomfort that increased with each step deeper into the tunnel. Eyes watered as the acrid haze thickened unexpectedly, reducing visibility to mere feet. The crew, experienced cavers accustomed to dust and confined spaces, found themselves caught off guard by the smoke's behaviour. It descended rather than rising, spreading outward in low, suffocating sheets that clung stubbornly to the uneven floors and walls. Whispers of concern spread quickly, the sound muffled and distorted, as if the cavern absorbed the words before they could escape. Water droplets hung suspended in the smoke, refusing to fall, twisting through the air with a slow, unnatural grace. Lanterns flickered violently as light refracted through these droplets, creating ephemeral patterns on the stone. The men instinctively recoiled from the shifting shapes, unsure if they were encountering shadows, smoke, or some phenomenon beyond comprehension. The cave seemed to mock the predictability of physics, forcing every person within it to question their senses. In 1941, a group of surveyors entered Cascade Cave with the aim of mapping unexplored chambers. Their meticulous records described the early passageways as narrow but stable, with steady air currents and manageable smoke from occasional torches. Yet, when the explorers reached the central chamber, they encountered conditions that no previous report had prepared them for. Within minutes, several men fell, coughing violently, their progress arrested by the sudden and unexplainable movement of smoke that rolled downward like a living wave. A faint warmth rose from the ground, countering the chill that normally permeates underground chambers, yet it brought no comfort. The juxtaposition of temperature disoriented the crew, creating an uneasy sensation that the cave was shifting around them. Hands became clammy, grips on tools uncertain, and every step demanded intense concentration. The floor seemed uneven despite careful observation, as though the smoke had distorted perception, bending the chamber itself into something unstable and alien. The tunnel seemed to tilt, though the floor remained flat, confusing all perception. Lanterns cast uneven shadows on walls that appeared to swell and contract with the movement of the smoke. Breathing became laborious, each exhale dragging against the weight of the dense, downward-falling haze. The men instinctively hugged the walls, hoping for some stability, yet the smoke followed them relentlessly, seeping into every nook and crevice, unyielding to human control. Fear gripped the team as the smoke defied every expectation of physics. Experienced cavers whispered of similar phenomena from distant regions, rare events where subterranean smoke behaved in ways that confounded logic, yet none of them had ever confronted it directly. Panic crept in slowly at first, like an insidious companion, until hesitation became impossible to distinguish from action. Every decision, every movement forward, carried the constant threat of incapacitation. A shaft of light revealed twisted shadows that moved independently of the men, the smoke casting forms that seemed animated with sinister intent. Stalactites became elongated silhouettes, stalagmites distorted into grotesque shapes. The explorers stumbled over what appeared to be solid stone, only to find it was a combination of smoke and shadow, an illusion that tricked the senses and tested the mind. Reality and perception blurred within the chamber, amplifying the danger beyond the mere presence of the smoke itself. Lanterns flickered violently as the air shifted, casting panic across stone walls. Men stumbled, some coughing uncontrollably, others gasping for the thin patches of breathable air. Instruments designed to measure temperature and airflow recorded nothing extraordinary, yet the effects were undeniable. The cave had become an environment where traditional tools and logic could no longer provide guidance, and survival depended entirely on instinct and the frailty of human endurance. Instruments recorded no abnormal pressure, yet the smoke fell in defiance of gravity, creating pockets that trapped explorers in small, suffocating enclosures. Attempts to move quickly only worsened the situation, as displaced smoke would surge into newly occupied spaces, following the men as though aware of their intentions. Movement became a calculated risk, every footfall carefully measured to avoid stirring the haze into more aggressive patterns. Lantern light caught glints off mineral surfaces, creating illusions of safe passages that vanished when approached. The walls seemed to breathe with the smoke, expanding and contracting in ways that made the tunnel appear to shift. Anxiety mounted, the weight of uncertainty pressing on the men as heavily as the physical smoke itself. Every turn brought new challenges, and the natural geometry of the cave became a deceptive labyrinth, impossible to navigate reliably. The acrid taste of smoke coated mouths and throats, forcing the men to cough or choke in rapid succession. Even those accustomed to harsh subterranean conditions struggled against the immediate effects. Heart rates climbed, hands trembled, and the instinct to flee clashed with the confusion imposed by the dense downward-moving air. Each inhalation carried the threat of weakness, a subtle but inexorable push toward incapacitation. Stalactites dripped over the chamber's uneven floors, their rhythm drowned by the oppressive thickness of the smoke. Sound became distorted, echoing strangely, giving the illusion of movement and proximity that was entirely misleading. Calls for assistance were muffled and scattered by the haze, leaving men disoriented and isolated despite their proximity to one another. Communication failed, leaving only instinct and sensory perception as guides. Patches of smoke clung stubbornly to depressions in the floor, creating miniature pockets that were nearly impossible to traverse. Men who attempted to step over them found their limbs ensnared by the dense air, each motion slowing as though resisted by invisible pressure. The effect was gradual but insidious, rendering even small distances perilous. By the time awareness fully registered the danger, several explorers had already collapsed, overcome by the smoke's strange downward pull. A heavy quiet settled between bursts of movement, a deceptive lull that betrayed the ongoing danger. The cavern seemed to pause as if considering the next stage, yet the smoke continued its relentless creep, undetectable by normal instruments. In these moments, the explorers realized that normal strategies for retreat were insufficient, for the environment itself had become an active agent, guiding them into its traps with patient, invisible hands. An unnatural stillness followed moments of turbulence, further confounding perception. Sound, movement, and visual cues failed to provide reliable information, leaving only the body's instinctive reactions as a guide. Even attempts to shout or signal each other produced muted effects, swallowed by the smoke and distorted by irregular chamber geometry. Survival depended on adaptation to an environment that obeyed none of the rules learned above ground. Coughing and choking continued as men sought high ground, assuming the smoke would behave like ordinary fumes and rise. The opposite occurred. Smoke flowed downward into recesses and low passages, undermining every expectation. Strategies of avoidance proved futile as the downward-moving air filled previously safe areas, forcing retreat into unfamiliar, disorienting passages. The cave became a predator, and the men its unwitting prey. Every attempt to locate a safe corridor revealed new hazards. Tools abandoned in haste became obstacles. Reflections of lantern light misled perception, and smoke filled every crevice. Each choice carried immediate consequences, and hesitation often resulted in collapse. The interplay of physical danger and psychological strain created a feedback loop of fear and disorientation, making the cavern a crucible of endurance and confusion. By the time rescuers reached the area days later, the cave bore no outward signs of disturbance. Smoke had dissipated, leaving stone surfaces untouched and passageways open. The remains of equipment and scattered personal effects were the only testament to the catastrophe that had occurred. Investigators could only infer the mechanisms of the suffocation, and the downward-moving smoke remained a mystery, defying natural explanation. The events of Cascade Cave became a cautionary tale, documented carefully in mining and exploration records. Subsequent visitors noted subtle variations in air movement and smoke behaviour, yet the chamber continued to elude predictable patterns. Fear and fascination mingled, ensuring that few ventured into the deepest sections without meticulous preparation. The cave remained a testament to the unpredictable forces that can lurk beneath the surface, invisible yet deadly. The smoke still lingers, descending silently in corners where explorers fear to tread. The guides lost in Carter City Cave. A familiar bend in the tunnel now led to unfamiliar shadows, stretching across walls that had been memorized countless times. Every corner that once offered reassurance now presented uncertainty, and the guides hesitated, their practiced confidence faltering. Lanterns illuminated walls patterned with familiar striations, yet the angles and contours seemed subtly wrong, as though the cave itself had shifted overnight. Hands traced the walls instinctively, seeking the markers they had left before, but the scratches and carvings appeared misplaced, worn in areas they had not touched. Each touch produced a sense of dislocation, a creeping realization that the cavern no longer adhered to the geometry of memory. The guides exchanged uncertain glances, the quiet murmur of their conversation absorbed into the echoing passages. Bootprints vanished abruptly at the threshold of a narrow passage, leaving only the impression of disruption in the dust. Those behind followed cautiously, but each step seemed to erase traces of the previous path. Attempts to mark walls or tie ribbons along the route proved futile. Every sign of guidance disappeared as if the cavern refused to be mapped. The men's expertise offered no advantage, and uncertainty pressed closer with each step. Stalactites appeared rearranged, though no tremor had passed through this cavern. Shadows fell differently on the floor, casting irregular patterns that disoriented perception. The guides paused, reluctant to advance, yet compelled by their responsibility to chart the path safely. Even the rock itself seemed to have become fluid, altering familiar features into unfamiliar forms. The guides checked their chronometers, noting identical readings across the crew. Time offered no comfort, and yet it was the only measurable certainty in a space where orientation had dissolved. Each minute stretched into an almost imperceptible eternity, and the rhythm of steps and breath was disrupted by an invisible distortion that slowed perception while maintaining the outward appearance of progress. Unease threaded through every step, growing heavier with each repeated turn. The guides, experienced in navigating subterranean spaces, could not explain the sensation that the passageways looped upon themselves endlessly. The repetition was subtle, a corridor mirrored almost perfectly, yet just wrong enough to unsettle the mind. Confidence waned as instinct clashed with observation, creating a silent panic that spread among the men. Footprints that belonged to no member of the team appeared under the lanterns, vanishing into passages that led nowhere. The guides followed cautiously, trying to reconcile the evidence with reality, yet every discovery deepened the mystery. The cavern appeared to have a will of its own, one that erased certainty and substituted a maze of shifting, misleading paths. A low ceiling forced the men to stoop, yet the passage seemed to stretch farther than memory allowed. Distance became deceptive, and the chamber walls appeared to compress and expand subtly as they moved. Breathing became shallow from exertion, but even as fatigue set in, the psychological strain of the cave's betrayal was more pressing than physical discomfort. Every forward step was an exercise in doubt. Whispers attempted to pierce the silence, but replies faltered in the echoing corridors, distorted beyond recognition. Commands and reassurances lost coherence, slipping into the cavern's pervasive uncertainty. The guides' coordination broke down as the passages became a labyrinth of shifting features and deceptive perspectives, and the familiar hierarchy of leadership was undermined by the cave's inexplicable distortions. Every turn led to the same chamber, as though the cave itself refused their exit. Attempts to retrace steps produced the same room again, with the same faint markings, stalactite patterns, and shadows that seemed to mock familiarity. Maps became meaningless. Lanterns offered only partial illumination, and each decision carried a heavier weight. The guides moved with caution born of experience, yet the cavern's behaviour rendered that experience unreliable. Light reflected oddly from mineral deposits, creating illusions of tunnels that did not exist. False passages led to dead ends or loops, leaving the explorers increasingly disoriented. The guides relied on memory, methodical checks, and prior notes, yet even these failed to reconcile the physical layout with their mental map. The cavern imposed its own logic, one unknowable and indifferent to human understanding. Whispers of panic were met with hesitant movements as the crew sought high ground or narrow alcoves for stability. The guides understood the importance of staying together, yet the cave's inconsistencies created natural separation. Every attempt to regroup revealed additional distortions. Walls shifted slightly, passages narrowed, and the sense of direction became ever more tenuous. Trust in perception weakened, and reliance on instinct grew perilous. Tools and ropes laid carefully at junctions to mark progress were found displaced or missing entirely when revisited. The men's attempts at methodical navigation were consistently undermined, leaving only the cavern's own inexplicable patterns to guide or mislead them. Evidence of their work persisted only as fragments, a record of efforts undone by the cave's capricious nature. Time itself seemed subjective, collapsing and stretching as the guides moved. Moments of clarity alternated with episodes of confusion, making it impossible to determine how long they had been traversing each passage. The repetition of rooms, faint echoes of past footsteps, and subtle shifts in stalactite formations created a psychological pressure that compounded the physical demands of the environment. The guides attempted to leave signs of their presence, scratches on walls, ribbons tied to protrusions, pieces of rope trailing behind. Yet every sign appeared altered or vanished entirely upon return. It was as though the cave absorbed all human effort to impose order, erasing traces that should have provided orientation. Each failed attempt deepened the sense of futility, reinforcing the men's growing anxiety. Footsteps slowed and then faltered entirely as exhaustion and fear merged. Even the most seasoned guides experienced a breakdown in confidence, each movement a cautious negotiation with a space that seemed intent on obscuring its own geography. Lantern light flickered, shadows shifted unpredictably, and the men realized that nothing in their experience could prepare them for this level of spatial deception. The cave seemed indifferent, yet purposeful, as if aware of the human attempts to impose order. Chambers repeated, passageways twisted in subtle ways, and every familiar marker became unreliable. The guides, experts in subterranean navigation, were rendered ineffective, trapped in a network that obeyed no known logic. Their disappearance would remain a mystery, an enduring testament to the unpredictable nature of underground spaces. Marks left by previous expeditions were similarly unreliable, providing only fleeting assurance before disappearing or leading into contradictions. Even the most meticulous notes offered no solution, and all attempts to reconcile past knowledge with present observation failed. The cave had rewritten itself in subtle ways, leaving nothing for the guides to trust but instinct. And instinct was no match for the environment's inscrutable shifts. Every chamber carried echoes of prior passage, faint traces of movement that suggested others had passed through, yet no living presence was found. These signs created both hope and confusion, offering potential guidance while simultaneously deepening the mystery. The guides could not distinguish between real and illusory evidence, leaving them vulnerable to the cavern's distortions. The crew's disappearance was documented meticulously in local records, noting the guide's experience and the known hazards of Carter City Cave. Investigators and subsequent explorers observed the subtle anomalies that had confounded the team: repeated chambers, disappearing markers, and inexplicable disorientation. Even today, the cave retains a reputation for misleading even the most knowledgeable, a labyrinth that defies expectation. The corridors continue to hold their secrets, shifting imperceptibly with the passage of time, awaiting the next explorer confident enough to think the cave can be mastered. The frozen watches of Mammoth Passage. Timepieces lay scattered across the rocky floor, each one halted at precisely 3:17, as though some unseen hand had paused the flow of minutes for the entire crew. The dials reflected a faint shimmer from the cavern walls, and the uniformity of their stoppage suggested a singular, impossible event. These instruments, once instruments of certainty, now carried only a silent testimony to an unknown catastrophe. Bodies rested in unnatural poses, frozen mid-motion, some clutching ropes, others reaching toward a wall that had offered guidance moments before. The placement of each figure suggested no struggle, no attempt to escape, only an abrupt cessation of activity. Even the smallest details, fingers partially curled, boots pressed against rock, spoke of lives halted in an instant, leaving an eerie tableau for those who discovered them. Icicles hung from the cavern ceiling, glistening in the dim glow of bioluminescent moss that traced the edges of the passage. Their delicate shapes contrasted sharply with the stillness below, creating a surreal scene where life's fragility met the unyielding permanence of stone. Not a single icicle had fallen, though the ambient temperature should have allowed slight melting, and the passage seemed suspended in an unnatural equilibrium. A silence filled the passage, heavier than darkness, swallowing even the faintest scrape of equipment. The usual hum of subterranean life, the drip of water, the flutter of bats, was absent. Every sound made by subsequent explorers seemed to hang indefinitely before fading, as if time itself had slowed in deference to the frozen moment. The oppressive quiet amplified the isolation of the crew's remains, making their absence of movement even more haunting. Documents preserved in the county archives recorded the crew's entry into Mammoth Passage on the morning of February 12, 1953. Beyond these entries, there was no mention of their departure. Their intended path, described in meticulous notes, matched the layout of the cave, yet nothing explained why their watchers had stopped or why they were never seen again. Investigators who examined these papers found the details precise and routine, but the human element, the abrupt halt to their journey, remained inexplicable. Ropes and climbing tools remained coiled exactly as they had been left, untouched by time or disturbance. The equipment bore no marks of struggle, and knots that should have loosened over hours remained firm. Helmets lay nearby, lenses fogged but intact, while packs containing provisions remained unopened. The absence of chaos suggested that whatever befell the guides occurred instantaneously, defying the ordinary rules of accident or collapse. The explorers who arrived later felt an oppressive stillness, as if the cave itself had trapped the last heartbeat of its visitors. Each footstep echoed strangely, sounding farther and more hollow than expected. Shadows bent unnaturally along the walls, giving depth to spaces that should have been flat, and reflections on wet surfaces created the illusion of movement where there was none. The psychological effect was immediate, producing unease and a creeping doubt that the cavern might resist all attempts to fully understand it. Reflections danced across crystalline walls, multiplying forms and creating duplications that could not exist. A watch lying face up caught the light in such a way that its hands appeared to move, though they were firmly fixed. Stalactites mirrored in puddles created infinite corridors, disorienting anyone who tried to navigate by sight alone. Even seasoned explorers noted the effect of the cavern's surfaces on perception, leaving them hesitant and uncertain despite careful preparation. A puddle of water shimmered, yet ripples never formed, even when touched. Air seemed denser in certain areas, as though gravity itself had grown capricious. Moisture collected unevenly on walls, creating patterns inconsistent with airflow or temperature. These anomalies suggested forces at work beyond ordinary physics, small but cumulative, reinforcing the sense that the environment had imposed itself upon the crew in a way no one could foresee. Every examination suggested no struggle, only a sudden cessation, as if the cavern had claimed time itself. Investigators noted the identical stopping point of each timepiece, the perfect stillness of bodies and the intact nature of equipment. Attempts to replicate conditions or theorize the cause yielded no consensus. The frozen scene resisted interpretation, offering only visual evidence of an event that eluded every known explanation. In the faint luminescence of the moss and the subtle gleam of mineral surfaces, traces of human presence appeared preserved, as if in amber. Fingerprints on tools, footprints pressed into soft silt, and the faint outline of packs provided a ghostly record of movement that had abruptly ended. Each discovery amplified the sense of an unnatural pause, a suspension of reality in which every small detail became a fragment of an enduring mystery. Maps drawn by later surveyors attempted to reconcile the crew's intended route with the location of their remains. Some passages appeared shifted in subtle ways, the orientation of walls inconsistent with earlier measurements, and distances between chambers seemed stretched or compressed. These inconsistencies made even modern navigation challenging, reinforcing the idea that Mammoth Passage held secrets not only of spatial arrangement but of time itself. The surrounding rock and mineral formations contributed to an almost dreamlike quality. Crystals caught and refracted faint bioluminescent light, producing colours that did not match any natural spectrum. Shadows elongated and receded unpredictably, creating illusions of movement where there was none. Observers described the effect as hypnotic, drawing the eye and attention away from details that might otherwise have offered explanation or comfort. Human artifacts, immaculately preserved, suggested that the crew had not anticipated danger. Journals remained open to blank pages, pencils poised but unused, and headlamps positioned at entrances indicated normal preparation. The dissonance between their readiness and the abruptness of their disappearance highlighted the unnatural character of the event. Nothing in the environment had forced them to pause, yet they had not advanced either, leaving an impossible stasis. The cave's oppressive stillness and the exact stopping point of the watchers suggest a force or circumstance beyond human comprehension. Nothing in the archives, personal notes, or subsequent explorations offered a rational cause. The precision of the halted timepieces, coupled with the lack of struggle or disorder, creates a tableau as unsettling as it is enigmatic, leaving questions that linger long after the cavern is abandoned. Every subsequent expedition into Mammoth Passage approaches the frozen scene with heightened caution and reverence, aware that the watches mark more than hours. They mark the inexplicable, the abrupt theft of normality, and the permanent suspension of expectation. And yet, in the silent, frozen corridor, the hands of every watch remain fixed, whispering a secret no one has yet dared to interpret. The Onyx Mountain collapse. A hollow echo resounded from the depths, subtle but persistent, unsettling even the most experienced miners who had worked Onyx Mountain for years. It was not the ordinary rumble of shifting rock, but a deliberate resonance that seemed almost communicative, vibrating through boots and bones alike. Every creak and knock hinted at movement far beneath the surface, yet the source remained invisible, leaving the men tense with anticipation. Veins of dark stone ran through the mountain, pulsing with shadows that seemed to shift under scrutiny. Light filtering from the entrance barely reached the deep corridors, creating patches of black that absorbed sound and distorted perception. Miners noted these veins not for their beauty but for the way they altered the echoes of the passage, making it difficult to judge distance or depth. What appeared solid often betrayed subtle instability when tested by even the lightest touch. The team paused, sensing a rhythm in the vibrations beneath their boots that should not exist. It was an irregular pulse, almost imperceptible at first, then unmistakable. The ground seemed to throb in response to some unknown pressure far below, and each miner instinctively froze, listening for changes. The rhythm was hypnotic, a subtle warning that the mountain itself was awake and watching their intrusion. Pickaxes and shovels rested at angles that caught dim light, trembling imperceptibly with the mountain's hidden movements. Tools left leaning against walls or stacked in corners shifted ever so slightly as if nudged by invisible hands. Helmets and boots, scattered in preparation for the next excavation, bore faint impressions in the dust, revealing that even the heaviest instruments were not immune to the cavern's subtle force. These minute movements went unnoticed by casual observers, but were enough to set the crew on edge. Dust motes hung in the air, suspended unnaturally as though gravity had loosened its hold. Even in the absence of wind, particles drifted in patterns that suggested an unseen current. Miners noted that the heavier dust, normally settling quickly, remained airborne, hinting at subtle disruptions within the mountain's structure. It was a quiet visual warning, impossible to ignore once the eyes had adjusted to the dim environment. Early excavation logs from local engineers described unusual acoustic patterns, yet no collapse had been recorded until years later. These notes mentioned resonances that grew and receded unpredictably, with sounds bouncing off chambers in ways that defied simple geometry. While engineers at the time were puzzled, they had found nothing dangerous and assumed the mountain's natural composition accounted for the anomalies. The later disaster would reveal that these early warnings had been far more significant than anyone realized. Unease spread silently, unspoken, as though the mountain itself communicated a warning through subtle changes in rhythm and tone. The men felt it without discussing it, a collective dread that coiled tight around their spines. Each echo seemed to carry meaning beyond sound, a signal that the ground beneath them was more fragile than anyone could have anticipated. Tension grew not from panic but from recognition of forces far larger than human comprehension. Shadows flickered across walls that should have been stable, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. Columns of stone appeared to bend and sway when viewed from certain angles, their weight seemingly suspended momentarily before snapping back into place. Miners tried to rely on visual cues for stability, but the shifting light and dark played tricks on perception, making it impossible to gauge which surfaces could bear weight and which might give way at any second. A loose rock shifted in response to a vibration, sliding imperceptibly until it settled without sound. Though the movement was subtle, it hinted at the instability concealed beneath the mountain's surface. Miners instinctively avoided the area around the shift, though their caution could only delay the inevitable. Every small displacement magnified tension, suggesting that the collapse they feared was being choreographed slowly, deliberately, in ways they could neither measure nor control. Every echo, every tremor hinted at an approaching fracture, a catastrophe that waited only for the right moment. The mountain had given no sign of violent warning, only this gradual crescendo of tension through vibration, sound, and shadow. It was a quiet, terrifying inevitability, the kind that fills a space with apprehension before any sudden motion occurs. The men worked in tight coordination, yet no amount of experience or preparation could counter the slow, omnipresent pressure building beneath their feet. The cavern's air felt charged, heavy with particles that carried faint smells of damp stone and iron, yet somehow intensified with each passing hour. Breaths came more quickly than necessary, heartbeats loud in ears already attuned to subtle shifts. The combination of sensory overload and the mountain's invisible movements created an atmosphere thick with unease, a tension that refused to release even when men paused or retreated to safer sections. Miners' conversations fell to hushed whispers, not from fear alone, but from an awareness that words might disturb some delicate balance. Every sound seemed magnified against the deep resonance of the mountain, amplifying anxiety. Shovels struck the ground with care, and each hammer blow echoed like a distant warning, a reminder that the mountain's response was unpredictable and potentially fatal. The pattern of cracks and fissures grew evident only with patient observation. Subtle separations in stone, invisible in the bright light of day, became unmistakable under the mountain's dim interior glow. Miners who had worked there for decades could sense these changes intuitively, yet no formula or prior experience could predict the exact moment of failure. The cavern itself seemed to guide the sequence, holding tension in place before releasing it with devastating finality. Every observation reinforced a single truth. Onyx Mountain was alive with hidden forces, indifferent to human effort or planning. The echoing vibrations, shifting shadows, trembling tools, and suspended dust all combined into a network of subtle signals, warning and unheeded. The men had entered a system that measured their intrusion, waiting to respond, and no human skill could override its slow, inexorable calculations. And when the first roar finally tore through the passage, it was not sudden, but inevitable, as though the mountain had been holding its breath for decades, counting down until the moment of collapse it had long prepared. The sandstone tunnels of Rock Castle County. Walls of golden sandstone bore the faint scars of previous excavation, each groove hinting at centuries of hidden pressure. Miners had long noted that the stone was deceptively soft near the surface, but increasingly unstable as tunnels extended deeper. Each passage seemed to have its own temperament, responding differently to weight and sound. Even experienced hands approached with caution, aware that the rock could betray the unwary at any moment. Footsteps struck unevenly against stone, bouncing back in unpredictable rhythms that disoriented the crew. The echoes warped distance and direction, turning familiar paths into confusing mazes. Sounds of equipment clinking against walls became distorted, making it difficult to judge where each teammate had moved. The subtle auditory distortions amplified tension, suggesting that the tunnels themselves had become a shifting labyrinth. The miners advanced slowly, testing each step, aware that the floor beneath might shift without warning. Sandstone layers crumbled subtly under pressure, producing soft, almost imperceptible tremors. The careful rhythm of their movements became a fragile dance with the mountain, where a single misstep might set off a cascade of falling debris. They learned to interpret the smallest signals, a settling grain, a crackling edge, or a hollow sound beneath a slab of stone. Shovels scraped against the hard surface, sending tiny grains into the air that seemed to hang unnaturally. Dust drifted in ways that defied the expected paths of air currents, forming twisting patterns that made the space feel alive. Miners noted the strange motion of the particles, uneasy at how subtle environmental changes could signal unseen dangers. Every disturbance in the sand or dust suggested hidden instability, as though the mountain itself were whispering its discontent. A stray shaft of sunlight pierced the darkness, illuminating particles that drifted upward in defiance of expectation. The light caught the shifting dust, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The crew paused to observe, noting that the sunbeam also revealed cracks and fissures that had been invisible moments before. Even minimal illumination exposed the delicate balance of the sandstone, hinting at the possibility of collapse in areas previously deemed secure. Tension wound silently through the group, eyes flitting to shadows that seemed to tremble at the edge of vision. Anxiety grew not from overt danger, but from the unnerving sensation that the tunnels were subtly changing. Walls that had appeared stable in the morning seemed to lean closer by afternoon, and dark recesses that had once been empty now suggested hidden voids. The psychological weight of this uncertainty pressed on every miner, forcing hypervigilance in every movement. A section of rock wall appeared to swell, bending inward as if the mountain itself were breathing. Small stones loosened and fell, sliding into darker gaps and disappearing from sight. The swelling was imperceptible at first, but grew enough to narrow pathways that had been safely navigable. Miners tested the edges carefully, feeling the instability with gloved hands, yet even the most cautious observation could not predict when a sudden shift might block an entire passage. Documentation from early miners mentioned sudden shifts and tunnel collapses, though records were sparse and incomplete. Local archives contained reports of small crews disappearing or becoming trapped for hours, sometimes days, as walls moved without warning. Historians noted that these incidents were not frequent, but when they occurred, the sandstone seemed almost to reclaim its space, closing passages behind the intruders. The legacy of these events lent an air of foreboding to every new expedition into the tunnels. Narrow passages pressed inward unexpectedly, forcing the team to squeeze through spaces that had seemed ample moments before. The walls were not merely collapsing but subtly reshaping, leaving little room for hesitation. Miners adjusted their angles and carefully shifted equipment to navigate the encroaching stone, yet the psychological impact of being constricted from all sides weighed heavily. The mountain's slow, deliberate movement left no escape from the growing tension. Every grain of falling sand and every minor crack suggested the tunnels were preparing to entrap those inside. The smallest vibrations travelled unpredictably, setting off subtle collapses that echoed through neighbouring chambers. Despite vigilance, each step deeper into the network carried increasing risk. The sandstone seemed to test the crew, gauging their awareness, patience and skill, as though the mountain itself were alive with the quiet intention to close in. Light diminished rapidly as the crew pressed onward, the golden hues of the sandstone fading into muted ochres and shadows. Even the instruments used to gauge stability provided little comfort. Readings fluctuated unpredictably, giving only partial assurance of safety. Every flicker of motion in the sand or wall could signal a change in the mountain's structure, reminding miners that no measurement or prior knowledge could fully prepare them for the terrain. The sound of stone grinding against stone became a steady companion, soft at first, and then increasingly sharp as tunnels shifted imperceptibly. Miners realized that the mountain's own movements were the clearest warning of impending collapse. Each subtle grinding echoed through the narrow network, resonating in ways that magnified anxiety. Awareness of these sounds became critical, as ignoring them could lead directly to entrapment. Even attempts to map the tunnels proved futile, as walls shifted enough to invalidate prior notes within hours. The crew marked paths with chalk and string, yet every return through previously explored chambers revealed unexpected obstructions. The tunnels seemed to react to human presence, reshaping corridors with slow, deliberate subtlety, leaving explorers uncertain which way led to safety. With each step, the sense of enclosure grew, a tightening embrace of stone that threatened to consume. The network of tunnels, once perceived as static and predictable, had revealed itself as dynamic and responsive. Miners moved cautiously, aware that the sandstone could claim those who lingered too long in its subtle grasp. The mountain's quiet, creeping power was unmistakable, leaving only one certainty: the tunnels were alive with a slow, inexorable force. The sandstone had shifted once more, narrowing a familiar passage until even light seemed to vanish entirely. The disappearance of the tour group in Carter Caves. Fog clung to the entrance, obscuring the path ahead and making the faint glow of headlamps appear like distant stars. The heavy, damp air carried a faint earthy scent that seemed to grow stronger as the group stepped into the shadowed interior. Daylight barely reached beyond the opening, leaving only the narrow beam of each lamp to carve the way forward. The cavern walls glistened with moisture, reflecting flickers of light that created fleeting shapes and strange distortions across the stone. Excited chatter bounced off walls, revealing both anticipation and the subtle tension of those unused to the underground. Cameras clicked, and phones captured fleeting images, yet the constant echoes reminded them that sound travelled differently here. Even the bravest in the group spoke with slightly raised voices, unsure if the responses they heard were real or merely reflections. Every step produced a chorus of echoes that warped and multiplied, making it difficult to know precisely where a companion might be. Stalactites hung like silent sentinels, dripping steadily onto the damp floor, marking time in slow, deliberate drops. Mineral formations twisted into unexpected shapes, forming narrow pillars and walls that funneled the group along precarious routes. Some tourists paused, craning their necks to trace patterns etched over centuries, unaware that each pause lengthened the time they spent in a space that could change without warning. The constant moisture made the ground slick, forcing careful steps to avoid falls. A creeping nervousness threaded through the group, manifesting in stiff postures and hesitant steps along the uneven floor. Whispers of unease circulated, though no one wanted to admit outright fear. The unfamiliar geometry of the cavern, combined with fluctuating echoes and hidden pools, created an atmosphere that weighed heavily on every mind. Even those experienced with caves felt a sudden uncertainty, sensing that the terrain could deceive and isolate them at any moment. Twisting tunnels folded back on themselves, creating the illusion that familiar routes had vanished entirely. Landmarks that should have guided the explorers proved unreliable as chambers duplicated shapes or merged into new openings. Decisions about which way to turn grew more fraught as every option seemed to lead deeper into uncertainty. The caves had become a labyrinth in which perception and reality often collided, leaving the group increasingly unsure of their location. A distant splash resonated unexpectedly, drawing attention to a pool of water whose depth and extent remained uncertain. Light reflected off its surface in trembling patterns, and the sound echoed in a manner that seemed almost alive, displacing the direction it had come from. The water's surface quivered unnaturally, though no movement was visible, and each drop seemed to amplify the group's growing apprehension. Some stepped back instinctively, unsure if the pool concealed an abyss or merely mirrored the cave's irregular contours. Flashlights wavered in trembling hands, illuminating cavern walls that seemed unfamiliar from every new perspective. Minerals glittered unpredictably under the light, forming sharp contrasts and deep shadows that shifted as the beams moved. The walls appeared to twist subtly, suggesting openings that vanished upon closer approach. Every reflection created the illusion of new corridors, while every crack or fissure demanded attention, reminding the explorers of the fragility of both the terrain and their confidence. Soft rumblings hinted at instability, small particles falling in rapid succession as if the cave itself were unsettled. The echoes of falling stone magnified, creating the sense of movement nearby though no visible collapse occurred. The vibrations travelled unpredictably, rattling helmets and rattling nerves, making each step forward an act of cautious calculation. The group slowed instinctively, aware that the environment could shift without warning and that sound might betray an unseen hazard. Voices fragmented into echoes that refused to cohere, leaving each explorer with the unnerving sense of being singular in a vast void. Calls for guidance or confirmation returned in distorted tones, separated from the original source, creating the impression of isolation even in numbers. Anxiety spread quietly through the group as individuals strained to locate companions by sight and sound, only to find perception faltering against the cave's deceptive acoustics. The sense of unity that had existed at the entrance slowly eroded with every misleading echo. Paths constricted unpredictably, forcing the group to choose routes that offered no certainty of return or reunion. Open spaces narrowed into jagged squeezes, forcing careful navigation through uneven stone and damp surfaces. Choices made in haste could lead to dead ends or further disorientation, and hesitation risked separation from the rest. The caves seemed to manipulate every step, guiding the explorers into a web of twists and turns that increased tension with each progression, leaving safety and light further away than anticipated. The ceiling appeared lower in some chambers, pressing down with a suffocating weight, while walls shifted subtly as if the rock itself were adjusting. Footing became more treacherous with each step, and occasional splashes of water sent startling ripples across surfaces once thought stable. Even moments of rest offered no reprieve. The environment seemed to pulse in rhythm with the group's collective unease, a reminder that the caves had claimed countless others who misjudged their hidden dangers. Footfalls faded in the distance as explorers tried to keep pace with one another, the faint light from headlamps barely illuminating the uneven floor. The cavern's geometry seemed to rearrange with every turn, presenting the illusion of progress while subtly redirecting the group away from the exit. Every glance over a shoulder produced nothing familiar, and every glance ahead revealed surfaces that looked similar yet impossibly new. Time and space seemed to bend within the darkness, creating a disorienting sense that the group had stepped into a place that was subtly alive. Echoes of movement from within the cave intensified, not with the rhythm of human steps, but with the unpredictable cadence of the subterranean environment itself. Water dripped in irregular intervals, rock scraped subtly against rock, and unseen air currents shifted, creating disturbances that the explorers could neither fully anticipate nor control. The cave had become an entity with its own agenda, demanding respect and wariness from all who dared enter. Even familiar objects and equipment became misleading. Ropes appeared to lead into impossible directions, markers seemed displaced, and landmarks identified earlier no longer corresponded with memory. The group realized that every attempt to navigate using prior reference points only compounded the confusion, leaving them vulnerable to further separation. Trust in instinct and routine began to waver as the environment undermined expectation. Panic flickered in quiet gestures and nervous glances, yet the group continued onward, driven by a combination of hope and necessity. Each explorer became acutely aware of how quickly comfort could turn to peril, and how every misstep might amplify the growing sense of entrapment. The cave seemed to measure hesitation and courage alike, rewarding neither with predictability, only with an ongoing subtle reshaping of space that kept the group in constant uncertainty. Light from the entrance, once a distant promise, had vanished entirely, leaving only the explorer's uncertain glow to trace paths that may have no end.